when the way we usually do things, by the time that I'm done talking, which I've never been accused of being concise, that we forgot what their question was. You know what I mean? So
Yeah, for sure.
yeah, let's do it like that. We'll just kind of have it running as we go. So let me go ahead and share the screen. And also, thank you everybody for showing up again. I'm glad I didn't scare you off last time. Let's see. So,
All right.
okay, so let's jump right in. First thing we're going to do is we're going to look at, well, actually, we'll do a little bit of a recap. So last time we were talking about just the sort of general idea that drawing is a response to a certain need, and it evolves with the times, basically. So like any given society has, certain open concerns, certain things that everybody's kind of churning through, and the drawings reflect that, because drawing is basically just another way to engage with life. It's not sort of special on its own. Sorry to say this at an art school, but but it is just like it's another way, like writing or like dance or like any number of other art forms that we have of engaging with things that inspire us, things that concern us, etc., etc. Well, anyway, tracking the general development of that, and again, Harold Speed does a really good job in his drawing book of explaining this. Is this idea that you can have this, and particularly early in our development, like, and most people really have this engagement with the world that is, they're not really too concerned about the image formed in the retina, by like the light rays that they're seeing and everything, because obviously we see things through light, but they're more concerned about extracting what we might call like 3D information out of the world, or sort of touch information, sort of asking themselves like, what would this feel like if I were to touch it? So it's not so much that you're seeing what the eye sees exactly. It's that you're using your eyes to kind of hunt for 3D information so that you can understand the world around you and kind of like recreate it in your head. You make like oops, that's a really bad arrow. Make a little like mental model of things. So this would be, sort of one extreme. This is, just a head, let's say, approach from that three-dimensional perspective. Now, eventually, and again, I don't know why it took centuries. This is just, this is us. As the centuries went on, like people realized that, the thing that you actually see is not, you don't really see objects. You see the light reflecting off of them, and that's, you interpret that pattern on the retina as being 3D, but you don't actually see in 3D. And I mean, that's actually, Impressionism is basically based around that idea that maybe you don't need to know anything about what you're looking at, and maybe if you just copy the resulting pattern, then maybe that's enough. Now, obviously, I think one way that's you can't really do this without looking at anything, so we're just gonna like pretend that I'm looking at a person right now. But I think everybody's kind of familiar with the tools that that are suited for capturing that that kind of jigsaw puzzle of shapes that you see when you try to get rid of like your associations and just try to copy whatever pattern is presented on the retina, whatever pattern is created by light and shadow. So let's say that these are two theoretical extremes. Let's say this is a kind of shape optical extreme. Now the word shape is a little bit slippery, but for our purposes, we're thinking of it as 2D shape. And maybe over here we have 3D form, and this is a tactile approach to this. Now this has nothing to do with like line or tone or whatever. You can express either one of these things with line or tone. For instance, you can have a drawing purely with line that, well, actually both of these are drawings done only with line at the moment. And this one is only expressing 2D information using line. This one's expressing 3D information using line. It's also not a question of finish. You can make this as finished as you want, and maybe the tactile or one of the tools available, to the kind of, let's say the tactile drafts person is hatching, right? Dimensional, 3D hatching. So this would be, and you see this in like Michelangelo drawings, and you see this in like just generally in older work. we're going to run into something pretty funny later on. Basically, certain people, particularly Frank Fowler, in his book and in some of his writings, says that, and for anyone who doesn't know, Frank Fowler was a friend of Sargent's. He was at the Occult in the 1870s, student of Cabanel, student of Yvonne. So anyway, we'll get into that. But he said that hatching was obsolete, or that it wasn't. It was kind of this thing where he was like, yeah, we don't do that anymore, or at least like not a lot of it. So anyway, we'll come back to that idea. But the key here is that, and this is something that you'll see come up in a lot of the drawings, that that line via hatching can be used to show 3D form, and line is not tied to 2D form. And I think, if anything, that's the major disagreement I have with Harold Speed, other than what he says about the stump. He has a funny thing about the stump where he says, like, the less is said about it, the better, right? He has like this huge like axe to grind with the stump, but then immediately he turns around and suggests that you should rub the charcoal or the red chalk with your finger, like a stump. So anyway, that's probably the one thing where like Harold Speed doesn't make any sense. I don't know if like a stump hurt him when he was a child or something, but anyway, it seems like a personal grudge. But he has this idea of like line drawing versus mass drawing, and I think that that's a little bit misguided, because again, line can be used to express either 2D shape or 3D form. It doesn't really matter. Tone works the same way. You could have something that is, you could have, say, tone that is only functioning as like these little islands, with no consideration for like the 3D effect that it has. And you could do that here. You could have like, just a pattern of light and dark and never have a thought in 3D, as you're putting this down. Or you could use tone in a, as a way of expressing three-dimensional form. So for instance, every time you put down a tone, really, it's like you're bending the paper. Let's say we put down a couple of tones right there. By doing that, and it's not so much like the process that differs, it's mostly what you're thinking about that differs. You can make tone without thinking about 3D, or you can make tone while thinking about 3D. And one way that I usually explain this to people is when you add a tone, if you're thinking in 3D, it's like you're folding the paper. Each new tone is like an additional fold that you're adding. But this same idea you could convey. Oops, let's space those out better. You could just convey this with line, though. I mean, you don't have to actually use tone to make something three-dimensional, like we said. So, the whole line drawing, mass drawing thing, I don't think that's a great distinction. I think that the more important, or the clearest way to think about it is more sort of like, is the person thinking in a more tactile three-dimensional mode, or are they more engaged in a sort of two-dimensional optical mode? Or another way to phrase it would be, are they thinking about the actual objects that they're working on? Or are they thinking about just the pattern that the light creates? So is it a portrait of the forms, or is it a portrait of the light? And again, these are two theoretical extremes. So most of us live in the middle. Most of us want some combination of these two things. Now, that's one thing that we talked about last time. The other thing is that these two modes of optical versus, let's say, tactile engagement with the world, they're also at the same time, there's this other concern between whether you're representing an ideal form, like we talked about a little bit about Plato last time, and just Plato's ideas spreading through Europe. In a sense, it's kind of like, are you interested in representing a reality beyond this one, which a lot of people were, this kind of other place that's more perfect, that's more eternal, that's more permanent, more orderly than what we have here? Or are you interested in the here and now? Are you interested in this particular life and, how it manifests? At the same time, there's also this idea of, you can kind of think of it, as far as this goes, as kind of like, on the one hand, making these people, or in a lot of cases, like representing gods, representing, just figures that they're supposed to look human, but they're not like an actual person, which is mostly, I mean, that's basically what Greek sculptures are, where you have something like this and it's like, yeah, I mean, it looks like a human, but it's not like any one person that you would meet. And if you're making a mythological painting, a lot of the times you need something like that, because if it looks too much like any specific person, then again, it's not a mythological painting anymore. It's just, half naked people in togas. Or you can start like the occult paintings, where you start recognizing the models and it starts distracting you from the actual story. It's not Zeus anymore. It's, Francois, the model that posed last week. So anyway, at this extreme, we might have something that's idealized and in a sense kind of like universal, and maybe somewhat generic. That kind of falls under a similar rubric. And on the other hand, you might have, say, like at the other extreme, you might have caricature, which is intensely personal. Caricature is, just like exaggerating the ways that a person differs from the norm, like what makes them specifically them. For anyone who's like looked at my Instagram for like more than 2 seconds, they'll probably recognize this. They'll probably recognize this person. This is my friend Jim, who models for us pretty often. And one of the interesting things about caricature is that, when someone's drawing in most sort of like naturalistic modes, they're trying to match the angle of each thing that they perceive, right? And that's the way they create a likeness, by having a one-to-one correspondence. Like if you see the nose going this way, you make a line that also goes that way. But caricature doesn't work like that. None of the lines here would correspond to the actual person, and yet it looks like a person. So in this case, here, I can actually, for anyone who hasn't seen it, just pull up an image of Jim real quick, if my internet chooses to cooperate. Okay, there we go. Now, I don't know if anyone noticed, but I did try to clean up my desktop since last time. I mean, actually, that's a lie. I changed browsers because the other one has 300 tabs open or something like that. But this is Jim.
Hmm?
And so even through the simple caricature, you get the sort of essence of Jim. And that's part of what it is. It's that this is particular, it's individual. By the way, excuse my handwriting. My handwriting's terrible. And this is, again, individual. So part of what happens is you have these parallel developments where, again, like Western drawing basically starts out based on form, based on 3D form, and also based on this idealization. And then eventually you're going to see this as we talk. There's a gradual movement towards representing 2D shape information, but also towards the individual particular model. And again, those things are not, they don't have to go together. I mean, you can use 3D. This 3D thinking doesn't have to lead to idealized figures. You could use it just to represent figures that are, you could actually combine both. You could have a 2-dimensional armature that you then fit 3D information into, and that way get a 3D representation that also looks like the person and not just like a generic figure. But in any case, these are ideas that we're going to come back to. This is just something that I want you to kind of keep in mind as we go through the drawings. Was there a question back there? I thought I maybe heard somebody.
Does anyone have a question? Nope, not yet.
Well, I have one.
Oh wait, one has popped up.
Okay, let's hear it.
Is it the idealization of the figure directly related to the Greeks?
Well, in the West it is. It doesn't have to be. Like you could have like an Olmec sculpture or something like that. The idealization that we run into in in the last like 500 years of Western life drawing usually does reference Greek sculpture. But and a lot of that is actually, because you even hear stories about some of the sculptors. I think Phidias was the name of one of them. These are like mythical sculptors that didn't represent one person, but they were taking parts, the most perfect parts of different people, and combining them into one sculpture. Sorry, did that answer the question, or was there more to it?
No, I guess so, yeah.
I'm sorry?
I think you answered it.
Okay. So anyway, this is where we're at. So we're gonna hop over to the 18th century, right? If we're gonna look at this is something that I found out, and some of this research has actually been in preparation for this talk. So Colleen and I started talking about this, I think maybe like midway through last year, and we ended up kind of pushing it back just because like a lot of stuff kept coming up. So I found way more things than I thought I was going to find, and we're going to talk about it now. So if you want to understand the general thrust of 19th century drawing, and we're just doing it in France, and we're mainly just doing it in Paris, and mainly just the Occult actually, just because it's a really big topic. But you have to look back at the 18th century, because a lot of the ideas that eventually you see in 19th century drawing are present in 18th century work, and they're exaggerated, so they're easier to see. In fact, actually, let's go back here. He's a little bit bigger. A lot of this begins with this guy, Lemoine. Right? Lemoine was mid 18th century painter. He was, I believe, painter to the king. You know, we're firmly situated in the Enlightenment at this point, so there has been a lot of scientific progress. There has been more focus on the individual. You know, it's not quite hasn't gone as far as it will in the 19th century. But even in these figures that are clearly idealized in a certain direction, you still see like a few things that are, you know, like a little bit more naturalistic. Like that arm feels, you know, it's not like this. This is supposed to be Hercules. You know, this is not like a super buff Hercules. You know, this is like hipster that you run into in a coffee shop Hercules. Here's another Lemoine drawing, and this is a particularly great one. This is for a painting of, I think it might be Hercules too, but don't quote me on that. Now, a couple things that you'll notice is that there's stumping back here, and it's done on late paper. Now, this is part of the 18th century. The 18th century and the Rococo in general was basically an era of abundance. Not necessarily for the common people, but, you know, it was the era of like absolute monarchy in France, you know, just kind of like unlimited power of the crown, and, you know, a huge budget for these artists to decorate palaces and all that. But one of the things that, you know, became a big deal at the time was there had been these ongoing debates about basically whether like Rubens or Poussin was a better artist and a better model for the Academy. And, you know, we're not going to get into the full weight of that, but the argument was similar to this. It was like, you know, what's more important, you know, color and light and these qualities that are more kind of transient, or form and clarity and order and these things that are permanent, right? Poussin obviously is on the side, or was placed by them on the side of order and, you know, what you might call the classicist tendencies. Whereas Rubens was more sort of associated with a certain kind of worldly sensuousness with color, with light, etc. So you actually see a lot of Academy drawings that are done in red chalk because it looks a little bit more like skin. You see things like, you know, trois crayons, which is basically just 3 chalks. That's what this is. So this is red, black, and white on hand paper. And again, these are kind of starting point. Now, Lemoine trained this other guy named Natoire. Natoire, you know, this is one of his academic drawings, and it's a fairly typical 18th century academic drawing. You know, again, very idealized. There was a model there, but this doesn't really look like the model exactly. I mean, can't imagine that it does. It's not about the individual. It's about creating this this idea of the figure, you know, the human with a capital H rather than, you know, lowercase h. You see a lot of hatching in here, but there's also stumping underneath the hatching. So the part of the procedure at the time was, you know, you'd probably create some kind of layout. Eventually the tones would be stumped. You know, you'd stump the actual crayon. and you go back over that with hatching. And again, that's another thing you'll see in these drawings. See, you can see the stumping in here and then the hatching over it. It's very dimensional hatching of the same kind that we were talking about over here. It's a very three-dimensional understanding of forms. I don't know if the shapes here match, the shapes that they saw in the model, but it didn't matter to them. And again, even the way that the drawing's approached, you can see, I think you actually kind of see a construction line here, but if not in this one, you'll see it in other drawings. And they were producing paintings like this. This is a painting by Natoire. So again, not something that I think would pass the kind of the bar of naturalism that's usually required at most favored at most academies today, right? It's just a completely different way of thinking about drawing and painting. And again, something like this, it's not that hard to imagine that it would be generated this way, thinking more conceptually, but again, also idealizing the whole thing. The trees are sort of like made of trees. I don't think this was painted outside, if that wasn't immediately obvious. This is just these are kind of like studio conventions. They're good enough for what they are. The picture in itself is, it's beautiful. It doesn't necessarily track with, our maybe like everyday experiences of light and of the general like form of individual people. But, that's not, I don't think that's necessarily what they thought art was meant to do at the time. So anyway, back, this is, by the way, as a point of interest, this is a class at the Royal Academy of Paris. And this was drawn by Natoire, actually. So here you can see the way that people held their boards, by the way, which is, like, they didn't have horses, they didn't have it, they just had their knees. That's what you put the board on. Board held at a 45-degree angle. I guess these guys over here get like a little bit more of like the podium. These must be like the very beginning students. This student is getting a correction from the instructor. This must be like the newest arrival because he's like, like cleaning rags and stuff. Also, another interesting thing that's different from the way that most ateliers are run today, no one gets their own little cast station. Okay, there's a cast hall. That usually there was like a hallway or a courtyard where everybody's drawing from the cast. The casts do not have shadow boxes around them. You just, the Occult had a glass courtyard, but in some cases they would also draw at night with artificial light. So again, also an interesting thing that eventually the Occult, and even like, a lot of these classes, at least at the Occult, were sort of later in the day. They're like from 4 to 6. And so there were times when, the natural light would run out, so they would actually use gas lights. Eventually, they started using electric lights. So during the day, they would work with natural light, but it wasn't such a strict requirement. I've run into that idea that certain studios today are like really obsessed with having natural light as an integral part of the way they work, and it's kind of like yes and no. It's I don't think it's a lot of drawings that you see from the 19th century, which we'll look at in a second, are not done with natural light, and they're fine. There's no issue there. Anyway, so again, and this might actually be indicative of that tendency towards idealization. The fact that the sculptures are in the room with you. So if you need some kind of hint, in a sense of like, you take these two models and you're turning them into Hercules or whatever. Well, you have the sculpture of the Farnese Hercules right next to you. You have the Borghese Gladiator back here, and you're just surrounded. There's Laocoon back here. You're just surrounded by these echoes of these achievements by the Greek sculptors. Also worth noting is that the heads are treated very conceptually. Like the heads that are not finished are just like an egg with 3 dots on it. Okay, you got little eyes, little nose. Again, it's interesting because it's very different from the way this is approached in most places today, where one of the refrains that you hear often in some schools is that you shouldn't think about symbols. You should let go of symbolic thinking. But this is nothing if not symbolic thinking. So it has a place. It might not be what a particular person wants to do. It might not be the particular philosophy of a school, but it's not like it's impossible to, what you do is basically, instead of getting rid of your symbols, you just get better ones.
Mm.
That's what the study of anatomy does. That's what, you just form. Because the problem with symbolic drawing is largely that your symbols are terrible for the most part. Like most of us as kids don't really know anything about the world. And even as adults, if we don't cultivate it, you're not feeding your brain with like all this structural information about how stuff looks. But if you do, then, I mean, that's more or less what drawing from imagination is based on. Anyway, fun story about this. So these are drawings by Greuze, who you might be, familiar with. No stumping on these as far as I can tell, although I've seen other drawings of his that are stumped, but a lot of hatching. So apparently Natoire was actually Greuze's teacher for a bit, and he came around to, here's some stumping on this one. There's this story. I don't know if it's apocryphal or not. There are a few versions of it, but the funniest one, and the best ones, is that Natoire came by and praised Greuze's drawing in the life room, but then he said that the figure there was something wrong with it, right? Like there was something like the leg was like bent in a weird way where it didn't seem like the figure would be able to walk. And apparently Greuze looked at Natoire being his teacher again. He looks at Natoire and he says, "I would be happy if you could do one like this one." And then, I don't know, mic drop. Apparently Greuze had a bit of an ego, from the brief reading that I've done. But here, for a little bit more context, because again, these drawings, you can only learn so much from looking at the drawings themselves. They don't always tell you what the person was thinking. They're not as easy to read, I think, as sometimes we think. But let's look at this. This is an 18th century drawing by Johann Daniel Preisler, who was a German academic artist who ran an academy in Nuremberg. And this is sort of similar. It's done in red chalk. The forms are idealized. There's very clear, like very highly developed conceptual knowledge of the anatomical forms. A lot of hatching. It's pretty firmly in the tactile drawing camp. Now here are some drawings from an instructional book that the same guy Preisler put together. Okay, so you can see that even at the linear stage, the lines are not used to indicate the light and dark pattern. The lines are used to indicate the limits of individual muscles, right? So the line is not being used in a two-dimensional way through the use of overlaps and by sort of weaponizing the line to show the limits of three-dimensional forms. He's creating a roadmap for the rendering that's going to come afterwards. Now, in the rest of the book, and also there's a huge concern for rhythm, through all this. You can see this kind of spiraling quality as these, curves for the trapezius and then leading into the brachioradialis and all of the extensors. How all of this is, it's basically an S curve. It's taking you this way and then this way and then this way and then this way and then out the finger. So that's one thing that I believe was a consideration at the time. This is also by Preisler. This is also from his book, right? So instead of having students just jump into doing something like this, there was a period of basically memorizing these kind of conceptual ideas. And this is basically three-dimensional construction coupled with proportion. Very complicated proportion, but that was sort of that was the way the drawing was taught at the time. Here's another drawing by Preisler. But you see that that's actually not an uncommon thing. Like here's a sketchbook page by Holbein, Hans Holbein the Younger, and again, that's construction, perspective, some boxes, a couple axis lines on these heads. Here's I don't know who this is by actually, but again, over the last since the Renaissance, this has been a thing that people have been trying to figure out. Not always very successfully. That's not a great one. But people have been working this out for a long time. Again, even from the time of Rubens, there has been some, consideration of how to simplify, particularly if the figures are being changed. You have to have some kind of ideal that you're shooting for. And these are, again, old Rubens drawings. This is by Raphael. And again, this is clearly a non-optical approach to drawing, unless he had two skeletons holding each other like this for this, whatever this is, like a pietà or something. But I highly doubt that. and again, the line is used in a dimensional fashion to show the curvature of each form. It is interesting to see this. I mean, that I guarantee the final painting does not have a skeleton in it like this, but this is just part of the way that they thought of the world. Like, people are made out of bones and muscles and flesh, so why wouldn't you think about that if you're representing a person? Raphael is not the guy that you go to for, necessarily just thinking about making portraits of the light or that kind of thing. It's a different, again, it's a different way of conceiving of things. And again, these are just assorted, 500-year-old diagrams, of varying quality. Some are better than others, but just this idea has been around for a long time. This is Sébastien Leclerc. He was also active in the 18th century, also in the 17th, so 17th to 18th century. So this idea, just kind of hang on to this, because we're gonna see this pop up later. And this is actually from a book of quotes from various artists throughout the ages that was released, I think, in like the 1870s. And here's Jean Cousin. Here's Giovanni Paolo Lamazzo. Giovanni Paolo Lamazzo did some really cool. Here's a drawing by him. Again, if you're drawing people that you're seeing from these like crazy angles that you maybe couldn't get a model to pose for, you're drawing ceiling decorations, flying cherubs, etc., etc. You need a system that allows you to draw stuff like that. And if they don't have to be perfectly naturalistic, then it makes sense to develop like some way of consistently producing three-dimensional figures. And I think that's actually how this thinking about boxes and cylinders and everything developed, because it was a way to create figures out of your head that was systematic and that you could consistently rely on. The other thing is that they didn't have models all the time, in the sense that like professional models, it was not a profession yet. If people are barely starting to work with models, you would maybe recruit, your assistant to do it, or maybe like hire somebody, but no one was like modeling full time, right? So part of what a lot of artists did back in the day, like Tintoretto apparently did this, and I think so did I forgot his name, but it'll come back to me. They would make little maquettes, like little like wax sculptures, and draw from those, right? So in any case, there's like a whole system developed around this, and it's not like these artists were forgotten. Like, it was kind of operating in the background. The ideas of Jean Cousin, of Giovanni Paolo Lamazzo. Here, Lamazzo is, I guess he wrote a book. He's talking about how the face is divided into 3 equal spaces, right? So it's like the forehead, the nose, the lower third of the face. So these ideas are old, and again, people were still talking about them, in the 19th century. So, okay, let's go ahead and look at the genesis of this. So Natoire, who we talked about before, Natoire ended up training this artist named Dion, V-I-E-N. And Dion is actually like the originator of, what we see now as like the, this kind of 19th century work. So this is some work by him. Again, not what you would really expect to see as far as like arriving at, like late 19th century drawing, like, and drawing and painting like Léon Bonnat and Gérôme, but this is where it starts. So he was actually the one who trained David, right? And that's now if you notice, again, everything's very conceptual. All the forms are, sort of like perfect versions of that form. There's nothing particularly individual about this model. Here's a drawing by him. Again, typical 18th century figure drawing. This is a painting from the model, apparently, done in 1745. Well, between 1745 and 1750. One of Dion's claims to fame is that I've heard it attributed to him that like he started the modern Atelier system, or what was then the modern Atelier system, but also that he created this requirement for Prix de Rome winners that they had to make paintings from life, not just drawings from life, but painted academic nudes. And so this is an example of him doing that. Again, there's sort of increase in naturalism, but it's not all the way there. Not what we would recognize as the kind of a more kind of optical, what would you call it? Like a kind of like an optical realism. That's not really there. These are also paintings by Dion. Again, he was one of the people that started embracing this idea of the antique and neoclassicism. So they started pulling away from the kind of abundance of the Rococo and started creating work that was a little bit more austere. It was a little bit more orderly. It was a little bit like, what would you call it, maybe cleaner in a sense. Here's a painting by Dion. And again, if you were to take that and compare it to, the work of his teacher, Natoire, again, a lot more stuff going on here. Everything's like a little bit more wiggly. There's a little bit more restraint in Dion. There's a little bit more, again, these words are kind of slippery, but maybe like a little bit more naturalism in this, in that it corresponds more to the individual forms of a real person, more so than this does anyway. But again, we're not quite all the way to 19th century naturalism just yet. And again, these are more of the same. This is L'Épicier, who was also, I think he was also a teacher of Dion's, although I might be mistaken about that. This is Francois Boucher. Again, very common, same thing. You get your black crayon, you stump it for the shadows and maybe for some of the halftones, working on toned paper, come back over it with the crayon, do some hatching on top of that, and then finish up with the white crayon. Again, very, very, very typical. And this is, again, a painting from the model that we looked at last time. Again, not realistic in the sense that you would think of it, but it's inching towards that. At least this is more naturalistic and more individual in the forms than, say, the Natoires that we just looked at. So anyway, again, this is what the French Academy is at this point in time. So here are a couple of drawings by students of Dion. And again, Jacques-Louis David was a student of Dion as well. You notice that the red chalk is gone. Okay, they're still working on toned paper. They're still working with black chalk. Black chalk, by the way, is basically a mineral or a kind of stone that they get out of the ground. This isn't with charcoal yet. Charcoal wasn't used for this because they didn't have a way of fixing it. And so charcoal was sort of like unreliable in that way. So it wasn't used for academic drawings until maybe mid-19th century. So at this point, you see some pretty heavy stumping here. It's on laid paper. Again, come back over it with the sharpened crayon to get the final contours, to get accents, to get to get these little indicators of form. And again, it's still in a sense a tactile experience. Like, this is the boundary of the external oblique. Was there a line there in real life? No, definitely not. I would put money on that. But it's the concern here is not that. It's not whether it's visually there. The concern is whether this expresses the form more truly, what the form would actually feel like if you were to go up and touch it. This guy has a mustache, so it's looking a little bit more like the model maybe, but still not, all the way there. And here, this shows you a little bit of how they might start this. Now, one common thing that, again, we're going to see in a bit is the crayon is difficult to apply at times. Conte crayon is fairly similar to this, by the way. Conte crayon was invented to replace this when they basically ran out of this mineral. The crayon creates lines on its own. It creates these really grainy kind of tones. And so in order to be able to use it to create these gradations, you basically have to use the stump. And so what a lot of people would do is they would, on a separate sheet of paper, or sometimes on the corner of their paper, they would rub off a little bit of their crayon and use that almost like you're putting out paint on a palette, and they would pick it up with the stump and then apply it to their linear lay-in, right? So this looks to me, this looks a lot like when you dip a stump into some like powdered crayon and just apply it to the drawing. And I have to say, I've been doing this a lot over the last 2 years, and it works really well. It's really easy to erase. It's clean. It's orderly. And it's also a good way of building on your linear drawing without obliterating it. So anyway, these are by Lacour, again, student of Dion. There's a ton of these online, by the way. There's a ton of them. They're really high res. You can get a really good sense of how you approach these. And again, forms pretty heavily conceptual. Maybe it looks like somebody. I mean, you can kind of tell the models apart. So again, there might be a little bit of naturalism creeping in. And Oh, here, this is a really good one, actually. Here, so you see the linear lay-in, then you see the application of the shadows here with the stump, maybe some of the halftones. And then over here, you see how, you basically finish it up with the pointed crayon. The pointed crayon usually you just leave unstumped, right? But these are, again, very, very instructive. The tones start out lighter than they're going to end up. Here's another one. This actually looks a little bit like a 19th century drawing. Again, the forms, they're maybe getting a little bit more particular. But anyway, I have a ton of these. We could do this all day. So let me just keep it moving through here. I will say that this does bear some resemblance to how people draw for animation today. That very sort of California has a strong scene as far as that goes in terms of this kind of conceptual tactile drawing. And again, there is that kind of fanciful element where, he was probably holding a pole or a rope, but, why not turn it into an axe? Give it a little bit more of a story, so it's not just a model posing in a room. This is one of Dion's academic drawings. Again, very very stylized in a very specific way. The forms are, again, generalized, so they don't necessarily look like one specific person, but just the ideal representation of a body. Okay? Now, David, this is a drawing attributed to David, but I think it's probably pretty safe to say that it is one of his. At the time that this was going on, by the way, at the Royal Academy, and this is what it was called. Before it was called the Occult, it was called the Royal Academy. It's had maybe like 6 names throughout its almost 400-year history. I believe that the time allowed for life drawings, 18 by 24 or 19 by 25 life drawings, was 6 hours. So the classes were 2 hours long, and you worked 3 days a week, right? And that's what the academy was. I don't know if the hours were longer in the private studios, but you'll notice, that is a significantly shorter amount of time than, how the amount of time it will take today, let's say, to work on an academic drawing. And again, the goals are different. This kind of approach, it takes a long time to learn all the anatomy and to learn to think in 3D and all that. And with the added pressure of taking the model and sort of changing them to fit the antique or to fit this this ideal conception. But once you go through the training, the drawing of it goes really fast. Like if you know the anatomy, making an arm like this doesn't take very long at all. And again, what actually is kind of a time sink or takes a significant amount of effort is making it match the model. If you're trying to make it look like the person, then you have to second guess everything that you know. So you have to compare what you know to what you're seeing and basically reconcile the two. And I think that's a really interesting goal. I frankly prefer that, but it is very time consuming compared to this. This is the very swift application of a tremendous amount of knowledge, which is basically what George Clausen was saying about Raphael. So that was kind of a trend for a while. This is a drawing by Vincent. Vincent was another student of Dion. He was one of David's main competitors. Vincent actually for a long time was the teacher who was getting the most people to win the Prix de Rome. It actually wasn't David for a while. Now, no word on whether this was an actual, if this is what the person's legs look like. I'm going to guess no, but I wasn't there, so what do I know? But again, same type of thing, laid paper, stumping of the black chalk. The lay-in is form-based, and it's finished up with pointed crayon. Okay, so that's Dion in his studio. The Vincent who just talked about, this is a drawing by one of his students, right? So when he was teaching, this is the kind of work that people did at the studio. Again, you'll notice that there is more of that overlapping. There's a kind of rhythmical quality to the way these lines are set up. And it's kind of faint, but you can kind of see that it's actually following the muscles rather than following the light and dark pattern. Apart from that, one thing that's interesting is it doesn't have as many interior markings as one might expect. You see that kind of, it seems like students were allowed to kind of put in as many or as few interior markings as they wanted. But you notice again, like the work is, modeled with the stump. It's work from top to bottom. That's something that we're going to talk about in a little bit. But now, okay, let's switch from Vincent's atelier to the Atelier of David. And David is obviously like the influential figure, particularly after the French Revolution, because he was basically put in charge of art for all of Europe. This is a 1790s drawing, but done by Gioacchino Serengeli. What happened after the French Revolution, and a bunch of people were executed, and definitely a regime change, is that David really did become the preeminent painter in Europe. And so students from everywhere came to study with David. And what happened is they would come to David, they would learn his whole approach and be imbued with this neoclassical sensibility, and then they would go home, and then they would teach at academies at home. And in a sense, there was this kind of French dominance of European art for a really long time, because even if you went to Denmark, even if you went to Belgium, even if you went to Italy, even if you went to Spain, everybody was a student of David. So the kind of regional flavor of a lot of these schools was more lost. David was also, this is sort of incidental, but if you have the time and if you can find a copy, Yves Gamel's book, The Twilight of Painting, is really good reading. And he talks about how David is probably responsible for the fact that people didn't do a lot of glazing in painting during the 19th century. Because he learned it. That was part of the technical equipment that people had in the 18th century and centuries prior to that. David at a certain point basically abandoned it and went in more for direct painting. And that's more or less how most painters worked throughout the whole 19th century. Glazing more or less fell out of favor. People did it to some extent, but not in the definitely not in schools. But anyway, we'll come back to that. So these are all works that were done by students of David. Some in his studio, some were done for other stuff, for competitions and whatever. But and actually these are interesting. So the guy who did these drawings, Giraudet, these are his academic or his anatomical studies. Here's another Giraudet drawing. This is by Gros, who later became a baron. And actually, he's really influential because he taught a bunch of people too. We'll get into his studio in a minute. But he taught Delaroche, who taught Jerome. So there's a direct line there. Again, you can see the stumping, you can see the toned paper, the white highlights, the finishing up with the pointed crayon. Again, no word on whether the bull was present or not at the studio. But this did get a prize at the Occult, by the way, in 1790. This is David's studio. Or I think this is allegedly David's studio, but it was probably something like this. Again, antique sculptures here, model over there, site size, obviously. People's easels aren't even upright, and here's the people. Here's somebody measuring. Here's a drawing that's allegedly by David when he was younger. Here's a painting by David from when he was in school. And we'll just run through. This is Eckersberg. Eckersberg was the people call him the father of Danish, like modern Danish painting. Basically, he ushered in a new era in Denmark in the early 19th century. It's called the Golden Age of painting in Denmark. And again, student David brought back the same ideas, same principles. So anyway, you still see a lot of idealization going on here. It's maybe a little bit more naturalistic, but again, still not the kind of thing that we're accustomed to. But one thing that David did do is that he, at least at the Occult, he increased the hours. So instead of 6 hours per drawing, students were now allowed 12 hours per drawing. And 12 hours for an academic drawing is the number that remained at the Occult for, I don't know when they stopped, but all through the 19th century, that was the hard limit of time, right? And so now one thing to understand is that the Occult wasn't an academy in the way that we think of academies today. What you would do is you would go and study at the atelier of a painter. Now, at the time, an atelier, what that means is an atelier is a place with a single teacher, right? Sometimes they were organized by the students, and the teacher just came to, give critiques for free, like twice a week. Sometimes they were run by the teacher, right? And so the idea is that you basically have like 40 or 50 people in the studio. They're all working in the morning. The hours are usually from like 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. or 7 a.m. to 12 p.m., depending on whether it was summer or winter. And models, as I understand it, would pose for, I think it was like 45 minutes of posing to 15 minutes of rest, something like that. Basically, it worked out out of a 5-hour class, the model posed for 4 hours, and you got 1 hour of break spread out, throughout the course of the time. So, but the Occult is a separate thing. So if you got into the Occult, what that meant was that you were able to go to this nighttime class and do more drawing. I guess it was an evening class. It was 4 to 6 p.m. So if you went through all the rigorous exams to get into the Occult, all that meant was you got to go and take 2 hours of life drawing at the end of that and get corrections. Like at the time, it was a rotation of teachers. So every month you get a new teacher. But that was it. It didn't have a curriculum really. It was just a life drawing class. And maybe you could go to lectures on anatomy and a couple of other things, but I don't even think those are required. So the Occult wasn't, in a sense, it was prestigious to be part of that. And one of the reasons why people enrolled was A, for the name, B, so they could participate in the contest. But up until 1863, the Occult didn't teach painting. They didn't have studios really on site. It was just, you go to the nighttime drawing class, that's it. And you already had to be pretty good to get in. So most of people's training actually happened in these private studios that they would go to in the morning. Now, the Occult was free. That's another one of the advantages. The studios you had to pay. This is a drawing by another student of David. Let's see. Here's the final thing. I think this is actually a relative of David's. And by the way, this sold for less than $250 recently.
Jeez.
So there's some crazy stuff on eBay. If you troll around eBay enough. I found a couple of academic drawings from the Occult from I think 1903 for $100 a piece. So it's out there. You just have to scour the web and see what you find. I like the auction sites because they usually since they're trying to sell you something, they'll take really good, reasonably good pictures of the drawings. So here you can see they're not afraid at this period to have just an outline on the outside. And that's true for most of the 19th century. Again, it's not a purely optical conception of drawing. It's done on laid paper, again, with black crayon. But again, even though it's the same materials and it's the same process as the older drawings, you'll notice that the sensibility is different. The way they're thinking about the forms is a little bit different. Something like this has the kind of subtlety that you actually do see on a model. It's not like every muscle is this sort of balloon muscle like you saw in some of the drawings by Dion. And there's even here too, there's a kind of extra emphasis on the harmony of each muscle working together rather than making each one as clear and distinct as possible. This is a picture of David's Atelier. Again, the boards aren't even held vertically, right? And you can see how they're holding the pencil and everything. A lot of them would actually lean their hand on the paper, but they would hold it from fairly far back. Again, at this period, people are working basically top to bottom in a lot of cases. So you can rest your hand on the paper and it's not going to smudge anything because there's nothing to smudge. Also, the painters, not even facing the model. They're perpendicular to the model and turning their heads to paint. This guy's squinting, I think. The 2 pixels that make up his eyes look like he's squinting. Anyway, so that's David's Atelier. Now, again, we've engaged in a little bit of speculation about how this was done. This is Drolling, by the way. We're going to talk about him a little bit later. He ran a very successful studio mid-century. Now, okay, so we've seen some of the fundamental characteristics of these Davidian drawings, right? One thing to remember is that these ateliers are almost interchangeable. Right, so David was teaching at the same guy as Regnault, who was another student of Dion, who was a competitor, at the same time as Vincent. Honestly, the kind of instruction that students got, it was the same thing. It was like absolutely the same thing. Like you can look at a drawing from David's studio and a drawing from Regnault's studio, and it's difficult to tell the difference. This is a drawing by Regnault. So again, very idealized, and stumping in the back, hatching on top, same thing, very idealized forms. This is a painting by Regnault. So again, we're not talking the same kind of optical naturalism that is pursued in most modern schools. Not at this point. Now, okay, so let's say that again we looked at all this, looked at the Atelier of David. So how were these things done? Do we know? The answer is more or less. So Javier Fabre was a student of David. He's a very successful student of David. He's the guy that made this painting. And for whatever reason, I don't know if he just like missed class a lot or like what his issue was, but he left a bunch of drawings that are halfway done. It almost looks like a tutorial. So let's take a look at that now. This is the beginning stage of, what was basically something like this painting. It's like you could see something like this being started with exactly this. And again, the simplification is based on form, not based on the light pattern, right? And so his effort, even though it's a line drawing, is in defining form, in overlapping forms, in arranging forms, in making sure that the forms make sense, that he's accounting for all of the muscles and bones that would be there on a person. So it's to make the person like a viable recreation. That face is bizarre, but yeah, again, neoclassicism. So anyway, from this stage, you can see him indicating the shadow pattern here, right? And maybe filling this in lightly with black chalk. Okay, so what does step 2 look like? Step 2 looks like this. This is filling in the background and the shadows with the black chalk. You can still see, again, the little outlines for the edges of the forms. And again, they have like a diagram memorized. I mean, it basically looks like a Greek sculpture. You have like 3 of these ribs showing between the chest. You have this very clear arrangement of, the cartilage of the ribs. You usually get to see like 2 or 3 of these. Then you see the ribs proper, then you see the serratus. It's very orderly, very clean. The abs are, like big abdominal, the little fold, and then another big abdominal. And it's consistent. Here and everywhere. If we hop over to Russia, these are Russian academic drawings, organized more or less chronologically. You run into the same diagram. The same idea, because they're looking at the same Greek sculptures. So also the same fanciful desire to add like lutes and wings and little Laocoon heads. If you look at this this cursory drawing of the Laocoon, you'll notice it's basically an egg with axis lines running through it. So it's not thought of in that optical way here. Now here's a challenge. The next time that just for kicks, the next time that you do an academic drawing, try to add wings and see what your teachers say. We've kind of lost the taste for that kind of thing. It's not really something that we do anymore, and it looks sort of bizarre when people do it. Again, actually, if we just look at these Russian drawings real quick, we're scrolling up to the 18th century. You notice they track pretty closely to those French drawings. You see more hatching. You see 2-figure setups. You see very idealized figures. The same diagrams for the legs, for the torsos, and everything. Not a lot of individuality in the models. Sad face. And again, the same kind of layout when the drawings are being started. Right? The same kind of like mapping out of muscles and that kind of thing. Not so much light and dark patterns. Russian drawing basically originates with grooves in a sense. Remember we talked about grooves before? Catherine the Great, when she started the academy in I think the 1740s, if I'm not mistaken, they basically bought a bunch of grooves drawings and had students copy them, right? And I believe they might have even brought over like French instructors. And so eventually Russian drawing basically developed on its own. So it didn't have constant input from the outside. It was kind of, they got their start based on this French stuff. They worked on their own. They developed their own sort of like, particularly sort of like regional set of priorities and the drawing sort of is fairly independent of European drawing, it seems. They used to show us this drawing a lot when I was in school. Actually, this is what we were shooting for when I was a student. And again, you can see the same type of thing, the same kind of linear setup. It's very tactile, very form driven. Completely just thinking in 3D. Very little thinking about the kind of two-dimensional aspects. Here you can see a little bit of stumping. This is also in 3 crayons. I think this is Oris Krupensky did that. And then again, more of that to the 19th century, greater naturalism, slowly but surely. And then here we go. Now, we have recognizable models. This is probably from the 1820s, 1830s. And this is, I think this might be, this is 1812 right here. So I guess that's the period. Again, by the time you get to Chistyakov in 1856, this is absolute naturalism. Now, we're not going to get into a ton of this right now, but he actually was very concerned about construction, and there's even letters where he writes about the idea of thinking of the head as a kind of mesh of planes. So that is basically he's talking about constructive drawing, about 3-dimensional constructive drawing. But maybe someday we'll do a talk about the history of Russian academic drawing, and we'll get into that. But anyway, the same development, this is what we're going to see with these French academic drawings. So back to this, again, you have your very conceptual, very 3-dimensional, tactile outline. Again, the shadow pattern gets filled in. Then, the background gets filled in a little bit more. Maybe you start a little bit of stumping for the halftones here, right? And it goes right over the linear drawing. The linear drawing basically disappears as you keep working. And then maybe you do some more stumping, right? And you start to get a somewhat more natural effect. You still use the pointed crayon to go over areas that require more detail or more sharpness. Here's another one. Here's a little half-baked hand. During this time, they were still using the white chalk. So that would be another one of the steps that gets added in. But here you can definitely see the stumping here, and you can see the crayon sort of raw on top of that. Here's another one. Again, I don't know why he didn't finish these, but thank God he didn't. So here you see a slightly more, maybe naturalistic development of these muscles, although again, not all the way there. And then that's the final one. So again, it gets finished up with the black crayon. Everything is, they're not super smooth drawings overall, by the way. They're meant to be seen at some distance. And so most academic drawings that you run into from the 19th century are not actually that smooth. And one thing that I would recommend is if you get a chance, museums tend to be pretty accommodating about letting you see things that they own, mostly because I think half the time no one asks. So in New York, there are a bunch of academic drawings kicking around in the storage rooms of the Brooklyn Museum, of the Cooper Hewitt Foundation. I mean, just any number of these places. I would start digging around because there's nothing quite like seeing them in person. When you see them in person, a lot of things become very, very clear. And if you can, the other thing I would do is just buy a really cheap one. Go on eBay and try to find one that, I don't know, for $100 or something. And it might not be a great drawing, but you'll learn something about the materials and how they were put together. This is more unfinished work by students of David. Again, at this point, I think everybody basically understands the process. Again, some a little bit more naturalistic than others. Here you can actually see a little bit more of that process too. Now, one thing that happens, by the way, is that these teachers have long careers. So their students' drawings at the beginning of their teaching career and the drawings that students make by the end do change, because the students are subject to external forces. The students get excited about things that they hear about, controversies, other artists that are working. So they're not just the influence of their teacher. Just for comparison, this is the start of a painting by David, a painting that he didn't finish. So these are the set of priorities that he had. These people weren't supposed to be naked at the end, by the way. They were going to have the draperies added. This guy didn't just walk out the house naked with his hat. And so the whole deal with this is, again, it's not an optical paradigm. This is literally building these people muscles out, right? And then he's going to put clothes on them. So that I think, and again, the diagram is the same diagram that his students are using. You know, it's like this kind of like international, like Greek diagram that pops up like everywhere if you look closely enough. So anyway, that's enough about David. We're about an hour in, which is actually we're making pretty good time. So now we're going to jump into the early period of 19th century work. Okay, the early period is basically dominated by students of David and students of Regnault, but one of the most popular studios was the studio of Gros. Now, Gros we looked at before. Gros is the guy that made this prize-winning drawing of the, I don't know, this guy hitting a bull over the head. So apparently on the back of this drawing, he had kind of a false start, which is great because that means that we get to see how he thought of this. So it's a little bit hard to see, it's a little bit vague, but basically what you find is that it's the same type of linear setup. It looks like it might be done with straight lines, although I don't think that was necessarily a feature of drawings at this time. You notice that the Fabres and everything that we saw, all the lines are curved for the most part. But you do see a little bit of straightness here. There's a kind of fluidity to the kind of lines that he's making, by the way. It definitely isn't like what you see in the Bard course. You know, it's a different kind of, it's a more searching kind of drawing. And again, it ends up like this, right? That's the final one. So again, this is work by the teacher. Now let's take a look at what his students did. Oh, too bad. Very small. Here's a cast drawing that was done by a student of Gros. Okay, so at this point, there's been some pretty major advances in that whole kind of optical idea. Like I have, very little doubt that this is pretty much exactly what this cast looked like. One thing you'll notice, by the way, is that in a lot of 19th century work, they're not working like casts that are pieces. I mean, they did at a certain point, but like in a lot of studios, by the time you got to a studio, you were probably working from full figure casts like this one. This is a painting by a student of Gros. Well, this is by a student of Gros and Delaroche. So what happened, and I think we touched on this last time, sad story. Gros, because of some external pressures on his work, he was kind of caught in between that like neoclassical sensibility, and he was the heir to David in a sense. But his personality was more of kind of like a romantic artist. He was really enamored of color and of movement and all these other things. And so in trying to alleviate that tension, he basically snapped, and he ended up drowning himself when he was, I think, in his 50s. So when that happened, Delaroche, who was one of his star students, took over the studio. Because that's another thing that would happen is that these studios would get kind of passed around. So like if your teacher retired, they're like, hey, you want the studio? And then someone else would just take over the studio. This is what the studio looked like. So you can tell that it's packed. Here's a guy measuring in the front. Again, no site size. This is all comparative measurement for the work that they were doing. These boards are just on their laps. They don't get fancy drawing horses. They don't get fancy anything. They get to sit on a stool and put the board on their lap. That's it. The painters, again, they're arranged perpendicular to the model, so they have to turn their head to see the model. You know, a lot of these studios back then, they had like 60 people in them. 50, 60, sometimes 70 people. So you couldn't really be that picky. These are drawings by Richard Parks Bonington, who was an English student of Gros. These are great because you actually get to see the process for a cast drawing back then. Cast drawing was no different than figure drawing. They were done in around the same time frames, like about 12 hours, at least at the Occult they were. And there's no reason to believe that these were any different. Usually, an academic drawing or painting was a week-long exercise, right? So you either had like say 4 hours in the studio in the morning, which works out to they were 6-hour weeks. So basically, in the morning you would have 24 hours to work on the model. If you went to a nighttime class at the Occult, then the class was 2 hours, so you got 12 hours total to work on your drawing. But every week you're making a new one. And say if you take 2 classes, if you take your studio class in the morning and you take the Occult class in the evening, you're making 2 finished academic drawings every week. Now, there were people that took more than 2 classes. There were people that took 3. So they're making 3 academic drawings a week. What that does for you is it makes you less finicky and it makes you care less. So that if you bomb 1 week, who cares? Next week, you're going to do fine. You know, live to fight another day, right? But one of the things that made it possible for them to work this quickly was the use of the stump. So we start to see the stump really coming into its own. You'll notice that a lot of the red chalk is just gone by now. No one's using that at this point. This is like right around like 1819, 1820. These are all by Richard Parkes Bonington. By the way, this is around the same time that Delacroix was working. And this Bonington drawing of the wrestlers, which is, again, a plaster cast, done with the stump, done with the black crayon, same thing. There's a drawing by Delacroix that basically is like a match for it.
Hmm.
And again, these are different studios. Delacroix was in the studio of Guérin, but Guérin was doing the same thing. Guérin was teaching basically the same principles as Gros, even though Guérin studied with Regnault. So again, these studios, the ideas are basically common to them. The ideas don't change that much by studio, it seems. They change every generation. So like every about like 20 to 30 years, the drawings start to get really different, but they get different in every studio. I think that's because it's because of larger priorities in the artistic culture, not so much because of like one teacher likes doing this thing or this teacher likes doing that thing. So again, here, same thing. I think the outline in these is starting to match a little bit more the kind of 2-dimensional parameters of like the real cast. Like, I don't think they're as because in some of the earlier drawings, it's not quite like they're making it up, but it's not. There isn't that much of a concern again for the purely 2-dimensional aspect. I think it's starting to creep in at this point. So again, you see the black crayon, like semi-stumped in here. They usually just put it on for the shadows. And the halftones, they don't get new crayon applied to them. That's just like the leftover crayon from the shadows that gets worked into the lights. Right, and again, here's the finish for it. Again, not super smooth, but from a distance, you know, it does what it's supposed to do. Same as the ones in Gros Studio. This is actually a portrait of all of the students in Gros Studio at one point. This is like a thing that people would do. They would just get together and have like a little like group shot. And they're labeled, the names are kind of small to see. I'm trying to see if, okay, so Bonington is number 17. So the guy whose drawings we were just looking at is this guy right here. Richard Parkes Bonington. And here's a couple more people. Let's see, I don't know if Delaroche actually made it in this one. Anyway, you can see nice variety of hairstyles in all these. This right here is a working drawing by Gros. So when he wasn't making academic drawings, this is the kind of drawing that he was making for, you know, his compositions, for his first ideas, etc. Again, nothing optical about this. He probably made this up. You know, it's a very, again, 3-dimensional, very conceptual way of approaching this. So it doesn't matter that it's largely a quote-unquote mass drawing, you know, because of the wash. It is primarily thought of in 3D, and that's the part that matters. Again, more cast drawings from the period. Painting. The paintings are getting more naturalistic. The Gros actually did have more of a concern for the actual color. Also, the paintings very bright. Prize-winning drawing by a student of Gros. But you know what hasn't changed is the process. Again, the basic materials, the basic procedure for working on these, that's all the same. They're substantially the same. Okay, so here's now, one thing about studying this stuff is if you decide to really look into this, you can't just rely on what you see. You can't just rely on your own observations of what they were doing, because part of what's going to happen is you're just going to impose your own biases on the work they were doing. So anytime that you can, it's good to find primary source material. So things from like people's letters that people wrote, just something where they're telling you in their own words what they were thinking. So this is an interesting one. This is a quote by Gros, and it says, Gros repeated often to his students, to the students that were drawing, it's necessary to proceed by the ensemble. The ensemble means the overall thing, like the totality of the drawing. So ensemble of movement, ensemble of lengths, ensemble of light and shadow, ensemble of effect. The effect is basically just the overall impression of the whole thing. Not necessarily optically, but the whole, well, the word's really good. It's the effect of the entire image that you're making. So how does it all read, basically? How does it all work together? It says, you should not occupy yourself with one portion without looking at the rest. Are you doing the head? Look at the feet, etc., etc. So that's one of the interesting sort of differences between a lot of work done today and work done back then. Periodically, usually with more impressionistic, more optically based ways of drawing, particularly in the United States, you know, the injunction by teachers is to work on the whole figure at all times, right? So you don't get stuck in one place. You keep working the whole thing overall. That's not exactly what he means. So what he's saying here, he's talking about working the overall thing, etc. So you might think like, oh, he means like, don't finish something, you know, before the other parts are done exactly, or don't spend too much time on like the head or the torso or whatever. But that's not exactly it. What he says afterwards is that if you're going to do a portion of the figure, look at the other stuff. So this is a crucial point in 19th century work, and it extends to drawing and to painting, that basically they work piece by piece, right? So once you do your lay-in, in a lot of cases, it's particularly for painting, they're painting the head, and then the neck and chest, and then the torso, and then the legs, and then et cetera, from top to bottom. But every time you're working on something, you're still looking at the rest of it to make sure it fits. So they don't achieve unity by painting it all at once, but they achieve unity by keeping that in mind, by making sure that everything that they add works together. Now he goes on to say, following this precept, he did not let them apply the white crayon on colored paper until they had finished the stumping. Here's the stump is an easy thing to find in French text because it's just le stump. So in English, actually, in some books, you won't find it as the stump. It'll be the stomp with an O. And that's actually something that I found recently, is that you have to account for certain like alternative spellings if you want to find the good stuff when you're looking online. So anyway, here he says that you have to always leave the tone of the paper between the light and the stumping. So the stumping is mainly done for the shadows and the halftones at this point. Let's see. Oh yeah, so and actually, if you're working on toned paper, the stumping is mostly for the shadows. So he's talking about using the tone of the paper as a halftone. And he says, so his summary of the system was bring every part together simultaneously. Basically, he says, like, in such a way that, like, if you were called away from your work, like if you were like yanked away from your drawing, it should like no part should stand out that much. It should be sort of like homogeneous in a way. There should be a kind of uniformity to it. Again, this is one of the kind of tensions and all this that, like, you see a little bit of variety with, like, some people just completely finishing the head and then moving on to the rest, and some people that maybe like put the shadows over everything and then come back and finish a part. But regardless, there is always, like, French academic drawing, the people that are working on this, they usually allow themselves a good chunk of time to focus on each area so they can just finish it. And they don't have to keep coming back to it and redoing it and redoing it and rethinking it. But basically, that's part of the freshness of this, that you basically decide what you're going to do, and then you do it, and then you're done. And you move on to something else. Again, this is a Bonington. You can see the stumping pretty clearly here. And you can see that in a lot of cases what they would do is they would end up covering a lot of the light mass with a very light tone, and then they would erase into that to get the highlights. So the erasing was done with bread for a long time. I've tried it. It works okay. You're supposed to use stale bread. In some of the stuff that I read in English, they said to use rye. So if you want to have a shot at it, you know, you bring in like a loaf of rye bread, make sure that it's a little bit stale, and you use the white part of the bread, not the crust. So anyway, again, these are, you know, sort of the main features of instruction during Gros' tenure, or in Gros' studio. Other people like Guillaume Lethier studied with another guy named Doyon. So he comes from a sort of a different lineage, but again, the ideas are the same. These are very typical, like early, like first quarter of the 19th century drawings. These are by, that one's by Blanc. This is by Ducournay. The Ducournay drawings are interesting because, again, they show the same typical features that a drawing by Gros would show, but done with his feet because Ducournay didn't have hands. So he had a whole career. He lived for like a fairly long time. And he just did all, like literally every drawing that I'm showing you right now is done with his feet. I don't know about the proportions here, actually. This is kind of a funny one, but you can see the lay-in for the head is basically just a little head construction. It's this thing. It's this thing again, the one that we saw in the early diagrams, the one that we saw, 500 years before in those, those Holbein drawings. The idea is kicking around in there somewhere. And again, these are working drawings, so you notice that they look different than the academic drawings. The idea for a while was you work on white paper with black chalk in the stump, and then once you get good at that, then you move on to tone paper, and you can use the white crayon as well because it's faster. That eventually died. Eventually, people just kept working on off-white paper. But anyway, digress from that. One point that we're going to make a little later is that all of these academic draftsmen, no one made academic drawings after they graduated, or not graduated, because he didn't graduate, he just left. After they left school, no one made drawings like this anymore because you don't have time for that. And so what these academic drawings are, they're a way for you to learn all of these things. They're a way for you to learn about, the silhouette. They're a way to learn about measuring. They're a way to learn about gesture. They're a way to learn about construction, anatomy, character, rendering, values in general. They're a way for you to learn all these things, but then you develop your own way of drawing after that, and you can just do whatever you want. And so what a lot of people did is they would work on tone paper once they left school because it was faster. They would work with the point in a kind of abbreviated manner like this. And that's something that you see very, very consistently throughout the whole 19th century. And I'll show you some by Bargue and Jerome later on. So anyway, these are the Ducournay drawings. Again, heavily conceptual. Here's that axis on the head again. Same thing. Not something that, again, he even drew the torso first before drawing the arm going through. Now, when you draw this way, one thing that is very useful about it is that you actually don't need a model after a while. Now, you might want to use a model. Your work might not have as much character if you don't use a particular model, but the putting together of the muscles, you can do that without any person there if you need to for your compositions or for your, for whatever. So that was something that was fairly common at the time. So just look at the difference between a working drawing and a drawing that was done in school, right? They're a completely different animal. Okay, so that is the early period. Let's see, we already got into the teaching philosophy. We already looked at, here's some process. This is by Pesson. Pesson was a student of Hersant, Gros, Ang, and Cognier. So he was at the Occult. So he's a student of all those people because they all, taught in rotation. This is his lay-in. There's a little bit more concern for the shadow pattern here. And you notice this is like a little bit more recognizable to, compared to modern drawing. There's like a bit of the straight line thing developing. But there's still, this is still based on a lot of interior markings, still based on forms rather than light and dark patterns. So that's, let's say the block in. This is step number 2. Now again, this is what I was talking about before, where you rub off a little bit of the black crayon and then rub the stump into it and apply the stump into your halftones. The shadows here do get some of the stump, or some of the crayon, sorry. And surprisingly, this is not that typical, but I think students had a little bit of leeway here. He actually hatched in a little bit of the halftones with the crayon. So you can see that he did all that. He did his lay-in. He did here's, what the lay-in looks like, basically. A lot of what they would do is, block it in with charcoal, and then they would come with the pointed crayon and finish the outline. So you would sketch it in. Maybe some of them just worked straight with the crayon. Basically, you make a preliminary outline, you then ghost it down so it's fairly light, and then you finish it. You go over it with a finely pointed crayon, and you go over it very carefully. Then here in this case, again, he filled in the shadows, he filled in some of the halftones, and then he goes over with the stump and he just finishes it. You see that? So this is with the stump applied, You know, that's what that. Nothing else makes marks like that. And then just work all your way down from the top all the way to the bottom. Now, that way of working is actually described in this book by a student of David, and we looked at this very briefly last time. The book is by Charles Alberti. I believe he was Belgian. And in the book, he actually so he has a bunch of plates, and then he explains what to do. So in this text right here, he talks about he calls it descente fondue. So you like fondue, like the cheese thing. It's called fondue because it's melted. They call this melted drawing, right? Because the stump melts the tones into each other, basically. So what I have highlighted here is every time he uses the word stump. So he explains the way to draw this. So he talks about basically he says once you're good at doing a lay-in, the word tray here means stroke. So when you're able to create basically the lines that you want, and you're well schooled in proportions, because everybody did have a canon of proportions for a while. Even if you didn't actually use it with the model present, you still have a general sense of how big stuff should be, right? So it's not like you're gonna whip out the ruler and measure the model exactly or make them fit this Greek ideal, but that was kind of kicking around in the back of people's heads. So what he says is that he's talking about the way to draw with the stump. And in summary, what he says is you mass in your shadows with a soft crayon, okay? And what he says is you're basically establishing the shadow planes. So they're not just shadow shapes, they're planes to him, right? And let's see. So he says basically what you're going to do is you're going to manipulate very carefully the crayon with, you just take some fine cloth and wrap it around your index finger, and then to spread the crayon with that. So you're basically using your finger as a stump, your finger wrapped in fine cloth. He talks about that, and he says that to finish, you end up using stumps made out of paper or made out of leather, right? And then tortillons. Tortillons are the really what's it called? The really pointy stumps, the ones that don't have two sides. So I guess at this period we're using those for the details. And I guess they would make their own, actually, because he talks about how to make your own. So anyway, then he goes on to say that basically because of lithographic technology at this point, he can't reproduce stump drawings in the book. So his drawings have lines in them, but he wants the student to copy the drawings, to copy the plates using the stump. And that's his advice for rendering. So let's look at what the drawings look like. Here's a bunch of stuff on proportion. You know, pretty complicated actually. There's a lot of stuff in here. He's a student of David, by the way. So Gros was probably teaching something very similar to this. And here's one of the rendered drawings. So his idea was that this is something that you would do with a stump. And if we go down, we'll actually find a couple more examples. It's the same type of thing. And then again, rendered with the stump. This is a particularly good plate. Oh, wait, never mind. I thought I could rotate it that way. I guess not. All right, give me 1 second because I just X'd out of it. And here we go. So you'll notice there's still a lot of, sorry guys, you're gonna have to tilt your heads for this one. You still see a lot of very conceptual knowledge going into this. You know, there's a center line here, the limits of the muscles are marked in. Again, not super smooth either. It's the same type of thing that we've seen in, you know, a couple dozen drawings today. And that was basically the philosophy of drawing around that time. Again, very first quarter of the 19th century. I think there's a bit of anatomy in here too. They give you proportions for kids. They give you proportions of people for people of different ages. You know, this is here we go. This is these are based on the, I forget what the name was, but I think an Albinus. But basically it's just a rehash of this really old anatomy book. And there's just a bunch of stuff in there. Almost every art book like this throws in a little bit of anatomy at least. And the book is called A Sure and Easy Method for Learning the Art of Design, or the Art of Drawing, Without a Teacher. So he basically packs in like everything that he thinks would be useful to you. Let's see, the beginning is a lot of perspective, how to cast shadows, how to plot shadows, how to construct heads. So he has like, there's a lot of just kind of like outline drawing in here, but he also has head construction. He has a really hardcore one here actually that I was like losing my mind when I saw it because I hadn't seen anything quite that clear from this period. That was, just like strict head construction. Let me see where it go. How to build an ear. Let's see, was that under this? Oh, here we go. We'll just do thumbnail view. Perfect. This is what I'm talking about. Honestly, fairly complicated. Like this is enough construction to the point where I think it would stop being useful. But I think this kind of thing was like, this is, at least in this period, more or less what people learned like on their own. Like I think you would learn this like as a kid, some of it, before you went to the studio. So you would have like, you wouldn't necessarily draw all of this in class, but you would have some sense of it. Because some of this stuff is like, it's not a way of drawing, it's a way of for you to learn something. And maybe you do a few heads like this that are like fully mapped out like a couple times in your life. And then later on, you can just kind of keep it in your head. You don't need to actually like put it out all the time. Anyway, so that about does it for, last thing actually. So I think a lot of people have seen these. These are the Julian plates. This Bernard Ramon Julian actually made a drawing course. This is the elementary drawing course. These are his drawings. And he was a student of Gros, actually. But again, no stumping in these because they're lithographs. You notice all of this is only based on dimensional hatching. And again, here he is using like, the tan paper, black and white. Again, very conceptual figures, exactly what you would expect from a student of Gros. Here's, one of the interesting things though, these are practical comparisons here though. Here he's kind of like checking to see what lines up with what, purely in an optical way. So again, that idea is creeping in. And you can see these are kind of like, these are before the Bard course, but they're the same kind of idea where like you would learn how to draw the features separately before you would put them in a head. And here we go. Here are these egg heads, right, with axes drawn through them. These are finished drawing by him. Now, the other thing that happened is that at a certain point, he collaborated with Léon Cogniet. Léon Cogniet was a friend of Delacroix and a friend of Géricault, and he was Léon Bonnat's teacher, right? So Cogniet put together a drawing course and asked Julian to lithograph. So these are lithographs by Julian based on drawings by Cogniet. Cogniet is going to become very important in a second. So the sensibility is a little bit different than the ones that Julian made for himself. The modeling is a little bit heavier. Again, no stumping because you can't on these. But look at this. The block-in is getting a little bit less conceptual. It's a little bit more based on, sort of like optical data. It never completely goes entirely that way, but it's inching towards that, or at least it's more of a consideration. These do have a certain similarity to the Albertis. Now, I would say that these are meant to be copied with a stump, probably, although that didn't always happen. So what ended up happening after a while is that people started complaining about the Julian course because they said the hatching was so complicated that students wasted a lot of time trying to copy all of these lines rather than learning about form. And I would say, honestly, like I would have to agree. Like at a certain point, this does become like a little bit too much for a student to handle. He handles it really well, but that's not the easiest way to do this. So that's probably why the Bard course was made in response to that. The Bard course is meant to be a simplified way of drawing, like a more modern way of drawing, in response to the dissatisfaction that people had with courses like the Julian course. Because the idea is that courses weren't meant for the occult. the people that bought these were government schools, so like high school basically. So if you do if you put together a good drawing course, maybe the government pays you to have it in every single high school in France, right? So there's money involved, obviously. And again, the Julian course eventually got replaced by the Bard course. I don't think the Bard course was actually used in anyone's studio. I think it was primarily for high school kids. And actually, we'll see some of that in a little bit. So, okay, passing through this period and moving on to the next one. This is the mid-period of 19th century drawing. So this is right about like, I mean, some of this is like, it's a big middle. It doesn't split up that neatly. So here we're going to address drawings from like, some of them from like the 1820s, some of them from like the 30s, the 40s, and maybe up to like the 50s, maybe right up to 1860. And then we're going to move on to the late academic drawings. So Léon Cogniet, who we just talked about, he was a student of Guérin, who was Delacroix's teacher. This is a drawing by Léon Cogniet. This is Stump City. You know, all over the whole drawing. Here's actually another one. This is, I mean, like nothing else does this, other than like maybe like a Q-tip or something. But this is smudging, is what this is. This is not drawing with the point. Now, again, interestingly enough, look at that outline. It doesn't have a lot of interior markings, and yet the drawing itself is very form-driven. So again, it's starting to creep in. You know, little by little, it's starting to creep in. So at this point, actually, it says here this is black crayon, stump, charcoal, and highlights with white. So that's interesting. You don't see a lot of the white anymore, though. The white is kind of starting to fall out of fashion, and he's using charcoal at this point, which is also not completely in vogue yet. Anyway, these are all works by students of Cogniet. This is by Léon Bonnat, who I think most everybody will recognize. He didn't do this in the studio. He did this in Rome. Bonnat never won the Prix de Rome, but he just kind of financed it and just went. Basically, if you made it to Rome, they would let you into the French Academy in Rome. Like, they'd let you come and draw or whatever. So basically, it's just a matter of paying your way there. Degas was there at the same time as him, and they were friends. Here are some paintings by Piot, who was also a student of Cogniet. Again, outline, fairly minimal, not a lot of interior markings. This is a study by Cogniet, which was in Guérin's studio. And this is interesting. So I couldn't find very high quality images of this, but I think this is more what it looks like. This is at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, by the way. Like a lot of these are, actually. Yeah, I remember I mentioned that before. So if anybody wants to take a road trip to North Carolina, let me know, because I'll probably end up there at some point. This is by Léon Cogniet when he competed in the torso contest at the École in 1815. More by Cogniet. This is the painting by Cogniet. And again, notice finished top to bottom. This is Léon Cogniet looking like a teen werewolf. And this is his studio, actually. So this is his sister made a painting of his studio. They actually ran a school for they had studios for men and for women, and I believe they might have been one of the first people to do that back in the 1830s and 40s. Another Cogniet drawing. Now let's take a look through here. So this is work by his students. This is by, I think, a Brazilian student of Cogniet. But also of Ang and a bunch of other people. This is what they were doing in their spare time, by the way, like, you know, anatomical drawings like this. And so these drawings are not just what you see here. You know, like at home, there's stuff going on behind the scenes. Like back home, they're doing anatomy studies. They're doing all this other stuff. They're doing a lot of sketching. Now, this is a block-in by a student of Cogniet, right? And here you see, again, it's starting to get blockier, right? Again, you don't see as many interior markings. They're not quite the same as before. And this is a finished drawing by the same guy. Again, the stumping, same thing. These are by Becker, who I forget if he was, I think he might have been Danish, but again, don't quote me on that. He came out in the 1860s. Again, here you can actually see a few more interior markings. But you notice, like, after a while, you start to notice these patterns in these drawings, and they're fairly consistent. by this point, we are fully in the realm of naturalistic form, by the way. Like, these actually look like the specific people. You know, these are not, Greek gods anymore. These are, you start to recognize models at this point. This is by Victor Moraes, who I think was Brazilian also. He was a student of Cognier and de la Roche, who were two of the most popular teachers at the time. You can see the little stump patch over here. And when you get up close to the drawing, by the way, someone's not taking care of this drawing. This is like really dangerous. This is what it looks like up close. See that? So here's the stumping. Here's the, here's some work with the crayon. So this is 1856, so it's probably charcoal by now. Charcoal really takes hold right around the 1840s, and it's actually attributed to Adolphe Yvon. Adolphe Yvon was a student of de la Roche. He taught the Occult's nighttime class for about 20 years. And Sargent studied with him, Bastien Lepage studied with him. Basically, like, anybody who was working in the 1870s and 80s was, if they were at the Occult, they were studying with Adolphe Yvon. But we're going to bookmark that. We'll come back to him in a minute. But apparently he made a bunch of drawings of sketches from Russia. Like, he went to Russia for a bit and made some battle paintings. And when he came back, he exhibited those charcoal drawings, and people liked them so much that charcoal became a popular medium. Then they had also developed fixatives for charcoal, so it was actually something you could use at that point. And that is where we end up in the 19th century, where we basically have drawings that are started with charcoal and finished with black crayon. By this point, the black crayon is being mined out of the earth. Conte invented the Conte crayon in the 1790s, I think. So a lot of these, if it says black crayon, it might just be Conte crayon, usually Conte #2. And I think it's the same thing that we have now. It's like the same make. I don't think they changed the formula. At least it doesn't seem like it. Between you and me, those academic drawings that I bought, I've been messing around with them and like erasing parts and drawing on them. The Conte crayon looks exactly the same as the crayon they were using to finish those up. So I don't think that's changed a whole lot. These are by Achille Benouville. Again, he studied with Picot and then Cognier. Picot was another major teacher. He was Bouguereau's teacher. And again, Stump City on all these. Here's a lay-in. It's a little bit more refined. Again, some interior markings, but not a ton. A little bit more concern for the actual pattern of the shadows. And again, an interesting thing. This is a working drawing, so it's done differently than the academic drawings. This is Thomas Couture's studio. So that's Cognier's studio. Again, he was one of the big guns at this point. This is the studio of de la Roche. Again, the paintings basically indistinguishable. Now these are really interesting. So a couple of things. De la Roche was Jean-Léon Gérôme's teacher. Okay, this is also right around the time that viable photography came about. So the daguerreotype, I think, was perfected in like the late 1820s, but I don't think it became super popular until a little bit later. De la Roche is quoted as saying, like, he says something like, "All right, well, from now on, painting's dead. We had a good run." Now, obviously, that didn't quite happen, but photography was an influence at the time. Now, I don't think these drawings are necessarily only influenced by photography. I think photography and drawing were influencing each other. Like, everything, as we have seen so far, everything was already aiming towards the idea of depicting light, towards the kind of more optical approach. And so photography is just another piece of that tendency, another piece of technology, falling into place. But the drawings were already looking like that anyway. Now, I do think that the photography changed some things for people, because think about it, the camera doesn't have to think about anatomy or construction or anything, and yet it produces a facsimile of the model, at least from an optical standpoint. So I think that might have had an influence on people. But anyway, this is Charles Negret. Negret was one of Gérôme's best friends. They were basically inseparable in the studio. And so we don't have any academic drawings by Gérôme, but I can't imagine they look any different than these. Now, this guy actually became a photographer. That's what he's known for now. Like, I don't know if he quit painting, but he basically just, like, he's known for being an early pioneering photographer. Here's another one of his drawings. And at this point, again, we're probably using charcoal at this point. You know, it's probably done with, again, the black chalk on top of that. You see the interior markings here on the lay-in. This is a painting by Delaroche. This is a painting by Jerome when he was still a student. It was supposed to be like he did this to basically to learn figure painting better. And it was actually his first official success. This is a drawing that is in New York. They say it's by Gustave Boulanger. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I think in the back of it, or like there's an inscription somewhere that says something like David Boulanger. So I'm not 100% sure. It looks like it could be his. Boulanger was another Delaroche student, and he was Jerome's buddy. When Jerome wasn't in town, Boulanger was the one that would go sub for him. More paintings, painting of everybody in the studio. Now, okay, take a good look at these guys. You know, as mild mannered as they might seem, except for this guy with the bandana here, this studio closed down in 1843, and the reason it closed down, and there are a few versions of the events. You know, Delaroche had been kind of depressed. His wife died really young. He was getting tired of teaching. So he was already kind of had one foot out the door. But what I've read, one of the main catalysts, and maybe the last straw for the studio, was that these guys accidentally killed somebody. So what happened is there was a ritual hazing whenever a new student would arrive. Apparently what they did is when the new guy showed up, they tricked them into a duel. Right? And they had like guns ready and everything, but the guns only had blanks. So, you know, they do the whole like paces thing, turns around, like, and he, you know, shoots at the other guy shoots at him. The other guy pretended to die, even though the bullets only blanks. So this guy pretends to die, and the new guy actually dies, whether from stress or from whatever. The account that I was reading says that he was sick already. So I don't know if it was like stress or he had a heart attack or what, but they killed the guy. So the police showed up. The chief of police was just like, shut the studio down. Delaroche was disgusted, and he was like, you know what? Yeah, screw you guys. I'm done with this. I'm going to move to Rome. Now, Jerome was visiting his parents when this happened. So when Jerome, you know, there's no internet back then. There's no anything. So when Jerome shows up in Paris again, the studio's closed. Anyway, what happened is that everybody got moved to Glare Studio. Glare was another painter at the time. I'll show you his work in a second. But basically, Glare Studio is where all the Impressionists met. Well, not all of them, except for Manet, but like Monet, Renoir, Sisley, all of them went to Glare Studio. Whistler, too, actually. Okay, we'll come back to that. So this is a drawing by a Spanish painter, Carlos Rivera, who was also a student of Delaroche. Again, the same basic features popping up again, but again, now with naturalism. You know, like every little bit of this guy's hair, you know, there it is. Here's a couple more. And there's these again because they also studied with Delaroche. This is just kind of a funny thing. This is a painting by Tony Robert Fleury. Robert Fleury, I can't find anything about his teaching. He was like a major figure at the Académie Julian. He taught a lot of women actually, and he taught men too. But the main thing I can find about him is that he was really handsome. That's all anybody had to say about his teaching. He was apparently really nice to everybody, and he was really handsome. I'll post about that on Instagram soon enough. I have a few things kicking around about that, a little bit of gossip. These are from Drolling Studio. Drolling was a student of David. These are by Paul Baudry. This is a Baudry painting also. Paul Baudry was the guy who beat Bouguereau for the 1850 Prix de Rome, except that they had an extra spot, so they just gave it to Bouguereau. So the whole reason Bouguereau got to go after failing a few times is because they had an extra spot. So anyway, these are all drawings by Anair. He was a student of Drolling at the time. Here again, you see the same features again, you know, same little stump patch and everything. Same concern for form, same concern for the individuality of the model. But again, they're practicing other kinds of drawing. You know, they're doing like little caricatures. Making cartoons of your friends was a huge pastime at the time. And actually, at the Académie Julian, they had a wall that was just caricatures. These are paintings by En. These he did in Picot's studio. Oh, and here's a drawing by Drolling. So Drolling was big into the stump, as you can see. This is a working drawing of his. This is one that he did probably, you know, at the Occult. He won a prize for that one. This is a drawing by a student of Drolling that there's a big note over here where he's basically complaining that he got number 2 in the competition and he thought it should have been number 1. And Drolling said the same thing. Like his teacher was like, "Yeah, you should have been number 1." So he decided to write all of that in the margins of the drawing. But again, you know, same thing: black crayon, charcoal, etc., laid paper. You know, finish with the. You notice the hatching's almost gone. There's almost no hatching anymore. The hatching, maybe you have like a little like love taps, with the crayon in places, but it's not as it's not as prevalent as before. And this guy eventually ended up moving to Australia. This is the very first academic figure that he did under Drolling. He did this when he was 13. So basically, he was 13 at this time, and then 4 years later, he did this one. I guess he was 17 when he did this one. But he started like extraordinarily young. Most people were not 13 when they started. Here he is actually working at the studio. Okay, so let's move into. We're gonna skip over Eng's studio real quick. I don't have as much stuff on him, but let's go to Picot. This is a painting by Bouguereau. Picot was Bouguereau's teacher. Here's potentially the studio of. Actually, yeah, the studio of Picot. So this is what the studio looked like. Again, no fancy cast station, no cast per person. You basically you pick a spot and you draw the cast. It's in the room, and multiple people are working from one cast usually. This is a prize-winning painting in Picot's studio. There was sort of like for a while, if you were just starting painting, they would let you just paint like a part of the model. So you pick like an arm or a head or whatever, not the whole thing. This is by Peels. Peels later became a teacher at the Occult. There's some more Benouville here. Okay, so this is probably the most interesting part of this. This is an academic drawing by Peels. Now, again, we don't have academic drawings by Cabanel, who was also a student of Picot. We don't have any by Bouguereau that are firmly attributed to him. But they basically look like this. This is the kind of work that everybody was doing. So Bouguereau's academic training, he probably made a bunch of stuff that looked just like this. Picot was there, you know, like 13 years before Bouguereau, I think. But anyway, it was likely, like the kind of work that Bouguereau did in there was probably very similar to this. And let's see, I think we skipped something here. Oh, that's the Atelier field. Let's see, and okay, the process stuff for Cognier, we already have that. And we already looked at this process stuff in here. So that's basically it for the middle of the 19th century. Again, you see certain features emerging. You know, you see the charcoal being used. Photography is an influence now, right? And the drawings are becoming increasingly individual to the point where they really do look like specific models. And basically, these drawings, in a sense, start to have more in common with photography. They're not based on photographs. The influence, the aesthetic influence is there. Okay, so let's move on to the late period. So the late period, you know, is basically, you know, we're only going to go to like the 1880s, 1890s, and the 1900s. We're going to touch on a little bit, but I haven't done, you know, my research hasn't extended to that quite yet. So this is the period that everybody talks about. This is when Léon Bonnat was teaching. This is when Cabanel was teaching. This is when Gérôme was teaching. The big thing that happened here was in 1863, the École decided that they were going to have their own studios for painting, and for sculpture. So instead of the École just being this evening class, it was going to have a daytime program where you could come and actually learn. Now, again, the École is a very loose organization. So what happened is they hired 3 people. They hired Gérôme, they hired Peels, and they hired Cabanel. And those 3 had a studio at the Occult. Now the studios were still just as freewheeling as the independent ones. You know, the students still did the pranks. The teacher only showed up twice a week, so the students were, you know, getting up to all kinds of hijinks during the week. And then but all you had to do to get into the studio was ask the teacher if they had room and if they would let you in. What they would do is then there was a probationary period. You would draw from the cast in the cast courtyard. The teacher would come by. If you liked what you did, then they would move you to the upstairs to the studio. You didn't have to sign up for the École to do that. Like, there were a bunch of people that were at the École, but they never signed up. If you wanted to sign up, again, you got access to the nighttime class with Adolphe Yvon. So a bunch of people didn't matriculate. That's what they called it when you actually signed up for the class. Yvon's class only had room for 70 people, right? And so one thing they did do, though, is they had a few spots empty. So if for instance, like, someone didn't show up, someone else could take their spot, right? But there's a funny description of Yvon doing that when he was a student. That he would basically sneak in before he even qualified. He would sneak in there because, like, you know, why not? There were spaces. And I know I showed this in the lecture I did in 2018. But this is what the students are like. This is Thomas Hovenden, after being in Paris for like a year. He was a student of Cabanel. This is these are portraits of L.A. Plummer by Frank West Benson by Joseph Lyndon Smith. This says before using, after using. I don't know what they were using exactly. Anyway, you know, something that you guys could do to pass the time. You know, start making some some funny portraits of your friends at GCA. But anyway, apparently in some of the studios, there was so much smoking going on that you couldn't actually see what was happening in the front. Like, if you were in the back, there was a lot of smoke, so you couldn't see the model. Now, again, this didn't happen all the time, but again, you can imagine how that would happen when you have, like, you know, you're like 3 rows deep and there's 60 people or 70 people in the room. This is Cabanel's Atelier. Okay, so this is one of the studios in the École. Again, École life wasn't fancy. It wasn't like this sort of very glamorous sort of thing. It was, you know, for the most part, like, look at their easels. Their easels are chairs. So basically, you have a chair to sit on and you have a chair to put your board on. That's it. You get an easel only if you're painting or if they run out of chairs. This is a stove, which is what will keep everybody warm. And here's the model posing. So let's go through a couple of these. So Léon Bonnat just had an independent atelier. So he just taught on his own. He taught for free, as I understand it, and a lot of people did. So the idea was people were already making a ton of money with their paintings. Not everybody, but a lot of the teachers were. And so what would happen is a bunch of students would want to study with them. So the students would rent a place, they would hire models, they would collect fees, and they would just run the studio. And they would ask a teacher, they would come and critique them. So the teacher usually wouldn't accept payment for that. They would just show up twice a week, usually at the beginning of the week and at the end of the week. So Tuesday and Saturday were usually the days. And the teacher, again, would show up just for free. And that was the way that ran for a long time. Even at the Académie Julian, I've been doing some research, and I haven't seen this published like in a lot of places, but Boutroux and all of them, I don't think they were paid. Now, the Académie Julian was a for-profit place, but the profit was for Julian, not for the teacher. Free. But anyway, I digress from that. So these drawings are done by Peter Croix in 1877, and these are in the studio of Léon Bonnat. Again, very naturalistic form. Now, one thing you'll notice is that there's a little bit missing in terms of, like, the forms are not as clear as they were in sort of drawings from earlier in the century. If you look at this, like, from, you know, the 1820s, it's the same material, more or less. It's the same process, more or less, but the thinking has changed. So his thinking was very dimensional, maybe a little bit less personalized. Here, everything's more personalized, but there isn't quite as much form. Or at least there isn't the same kind of, like, very sure grasp of exactly what he's looking at as Tisson did here. like Payson, I think for the most part could have drawn this figure basically out of his head, or at least like the anatomy part. You know, he already kind of knew what he was going to draw to begin with. I don't think Croyer could have done the same. Although I think the drawing is more naturalistic, but see, like the ear becomes reduced to almost like an optical statement. You know, it's not really an ear anymore. It's just kind of like the silhouette of an ear with a couple little nicks in it. So that's a tendency, again, that's occurring. Not every student of Bonnat was like that, though. For instance, Jacques de France, his work looks pretty damn dimensional. It's very simply painted. You know, it's not. It's basically like almost like 3 tones, more or less. If you look at the painting of this leg, let's say, you know, it's not very elaborate. It's very broad, but there is still like a very dimensional feeling to this. And here's the Atelier of Bonnat. Same setup as David's place. You know, that didn't change at all. This is by Lauritz Tuxen, who was a friend of Croyer's. You notice this is starting to get pretty flat, actually. So these are just becoming sort of like light and dark patterns in a sense. It's not all gone yet, but it's starting to happen. And instead of spending his time like elaborating the figure and making the figure more dimensional, he's spending his time putting the figure in the environment. And he's spending more of his time like painting. Basically, most of his time is spent painting his classmates, it looks like, rather than painting the figure. Now again, this is something that was done in 1 week, right? 6 days, 4 hours, so 24 hours to do all this. So something has to give. And what ends up, you know, being left out here is the form. That head is like, you know, 2 swipes of different colors, and that's it. Here's a drawing by Tuxen. And here's a drawing that's anonymous, quote unquote, but it's probably by Croyer. It's in the same collection, it's the same materials. Here you can see the process. Again, here it's pretty bare. There aren't a lot of interior markings in this. I think by this point, they were thinking about form still, but they were thinking of it more in like the sense that I was talking about here, where it's kind of like you're sculpting with tone, and they were mainly sculpting in very few, very broad planes. So they're not as concerned with the actual anatomy. Now, I think students became more concerned with that as they got more advanced. But again, there is a tendency here. We're seeing the seeds of something changing. Okay, now this is the Atelier of Cabanel. This is a Bastien Lepage that he did when he was in the studio. Here's a halfway done drawing, but this guy was Portuguese, a Portuguese student at Cabanel. These are kind of halfway done. I wish the pictures were better, but here you can kind of see like the charcoal being put in and the lights pretty clear so far, nothing really in them. These might have been done in Adolphe Yvonne's class. So even though they were, you know, you could be a student of Cabanel during the day, but if you qualified, you could go draw in the evening class. And the evening class is where you see like all these, well, you'll recognize it in a second. You see the setup in common, but that's where they had 12 hours to work. This one is by Emile Jules Pichot, who was a student of Cabanel. I'm actually going to go take pictures of this one pretty soon because it's at the Getty Museum. Here, again, this is the charcoal, this is the chalk, right? That's the Conte, that's the charcoal. It's pretty easy to see after a while because there's slightly different color temperatures. Here you can see the erasing, here you can see this basic line drawing that goes over the broad modeling with the stump. This is a drawing by Kenyon Cox when he was first starting out. So you notice he doesn't have complete mastery over the materials yet. It's a little bit patchy. The flow overall actually is pretty good, but he had a lot of false starts in beginning this. He has some great letters back home where he's whining about certain things. But anyway, this is the kind of antique drawing that you would do while trying to get into the life class. Now, cast drawings back then didn't have to be perfect. The cast drawing just had to be good enough that you could start working on the figure, and that's, you know, generally the idea they had back then. So here, let's run through a couple of these. Again, charcoal, crayon on top. Here's the little stump patch. Again, very minimal drawing when you actually get up close to it. This is by Bastien Lepage. This one got a prize. Again, same type of thing. Here's the crayon, here's the charcoal. And they're also modeled fairly minimally in the lights. There's an account by Julian Alden Weir of his time at Jerome's, where he says that they shade only enough to express shadows and halftones, like the principal halftone. And apparently Jerome, what he would do is when he was training people, he would have them mostly do, the kind of layout of the figure first, and then he would let them only put in the shadow.
We have a question for you.
Sure, go ahead.
All right.
So what's the purpose of using the charcoal and the black chalk together? What is the quality of the two?
Well, one of the things is what Frank Fowler calls the beautiful velvety quality that results when you combine the two, which I've done it before. It does look really good. The content doesn't look as good on its own. But the thing is workability. So the charcoal is a way for you to put stuff down and still have it be malleable. The crayon is not easy to erase at all. And so you basically start your outline with charcoal. You do the best you can with that. You go sit down, you go over it with the crayon. You block in your shadows with the charcoal and then the halftones as well. And then you go over it with the crayon again. The crayon is for solidifying your decisions and for finalizing things. And so you work the two together so that you have flexibility in the beginning, but you have clarity at the end and certainty at the end. But that was the purpose of using both materials.
Would the crayon be used for the hatching and then the stumping would all be done with charcoal?
Well, so more or less, yes. So you could stump over the crayon also. The beautiful thing about Conte crayon is that it actually does smear if you really try to smear it, but it won't do it on its own. And so most of the stumping does appear to, well, a lot of the stumping does appear to be done with the charcoal. But when you see the little patch on the side, that's usually crayon. And the reason for that is the crayon can't put a lot of it down directly without it getting too dark. So again, you just roll around your stump and you do that. For modeling in the lights, it was rare to really like hatch into the lights with the actual like charcoal or the crayon. You were mainly using the stump to put that in so that you could keep the halftones really light. Now, some people, after they put in more of the crayon, they did stump over it, though. But at the very end, you might have a few accents that were just done with the crayon and left alone, and that was it. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And it's the black chalk that they used in these drawings comparable to the black chalk you would buy at art stores today?
No, it's literally Conte brand black chalk. It's Conte brand crayon.
Okay.
So the same Conte that you can get at the art store is probably the same thing they were using. It's the same brand. I don't know if they changed the recipe, but like I said, when I drew on those drawings that I have and compared what it looked like, it looked the same. So I think even if the formula is different, it works the same. So just get yourself a number 2 Conte crayon and either the pencil or the stick, and it's pretty much the same thing. Sorry, what was that?
There's another question, but please finish your thought.
What was the other question?
All right.
So attached to that, they describe the fixing process as well.
So the question is, how often were they spray fixing their drawing?
Or like, do they discuss their process?
They weren't spray fixing during the process. They spray fix at the end. So the spray fixing was done with, actually they had a crazy like contraption for it. So there are a couple ways that you can do this. Earlier in the century, they were actually brushing on the fixative on the back of the drawing and letting it bleed through to the front. Later in the century, they were using an atomizer. So it was basically this thing where like for it to spray, you had to blow into it. And you had to get good at like blowing at a steady rate, because if you blew too fast, it would like splurt. But it was what's it called? Shellac dissolved in alcohol was what they were using to fix their drawing. So apparently, I think it did yellow after a while, at least a little bit. Eventually, they invented actual spray fixative, but that wasn't really a thing at this time. But it wasn't like they were spray fixing in between layers or anything like that. It was just the charcoal, when you stump it, it has enough adherence that it doesn't come off as easily. You're almost even if you don't put it in that if you don't press down that hard, it actually does like hug onto the paper pretty well. The paper is a laid paper. It was a rough kind of paper called Michelet. I personally haven't found a comparable paper today, but if you want to try it, Strathmore 400, the regular Strathmore 400 is actually okay for it. It's not like it doesn't behave exactly like this, but it works pretty well. Like you'll get the basic idea. Because the main point of all this is that you do a linear lay-in, you work with broad, soft media so that you can do broad modeling, and then you come back in for the details with a pointed instrument. That is the basis. That's the thing that all these drawings have in common, regardless of the differences in goals that they have. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So can I follow up one more?
But one more question for you.
Sure.
So when you say laid paper, isn't that like the charcoal paper that they sell today with the sort of like vertical lines in it?
Not exactly. So it has the same pattern, but some papers are not 100% cotton. Some are. Some fray really easily. Some don't. I'm looking. So what I might do is I might just buy a sheet of Michelet because there's still some like that you can find like online. So I might just buy a sheet of it. I mean, I have 2 drawings at home, like I said, but they're covered like entirely, so there isn't any blank paper left. The laid paper, the drawings that I have, it's a different brand because they're from the 20th century. The paper feels a little bit thicker than laid papers that I've used today. So I don't know. I haven't used a laid paper that I've really, really liked, other than there's one called Clairefontaine that my friend just found that so far seems to be behaving pretty well. But you know, if I find something that's like a dead ringer for this, I will report back. But again, for now, if you want to give it a whirl, Strathmore 400 will more or less do it. Like you'll get most of the effects that they're getting in here. But again, it's like, because actually the main thing that I've noticed is that a lot of laid papers today just they don't take the stumping very well. Like they just like fall to pieces if you start stumping on them. So that's one of the issues. The paper is always described as being rough French paper and as being somewhat thick. So unfortunately, they don't make it anymore. The brand is gone. But who knows? Maybe if there's enough demand, we can persuade someone to make something like that if we don't find anything that's already being produced. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's do a couple more of these. Again, this is probably the stump patch for this one, and it just kind of became the background later on. And in fact, you know, let me X out of this. A friend actually just sent me a bunch of Ecole close-ups. So if you go to the Ecole, you have to make an appointment beforehand. But if you do that, they'll let you see up to 5 drawings at once. So let's take a look at these. Are firmly like, this is like an 1881 drawing. Again, this is in Yvonne's class. This is by a student of Jerome. And again, they're not like super elaborate. Here, let's find a clearer one. Yeah, so here you can see a little bit of the hatching with the stump. Over here, it's not. There's very little hatching over on this side overall. Oh, here's a good one. You see that? So it's like it's fairly minimally indicated. There's no real effort to make this completely blend into this. You know, it's handled very, very broadly, and again, it's meant to be seen at a distance. And again, the lights here are being erased with the bread, most likely. They also have these things they call rubber stumps, which is basically like a pencil eraser. So it's like an eraser that has like a little point. And by the way, you can see in the background, that's a Léon Bonnat portrait back there. They're just like, the Occult is dripping with great artwork. See here, you can see a little bit of the crayon for the contour in the back. Again, more charcoal work all through here. Let's hop on over to another one. Oh, see look at this. This is the charcoal right here. Here you can see the accents of the crayon. Here's the outline of the crayon. And like look at that. Like look at how minimal that is. This is like basically a tone spread over this. You erase into it. Here's the Conte crayon. This is charcoal right here. The charcoal has a very kind of grayish quality you can tell apart, whereas the Conte has a more sort of like rich velvety dark. Like this is just an outline basically. This is just like an outline over you know, this overall like shadow here, and that's pretty much it. Now, I know the paper was supposed to be kind of off-white, but I don't know if it's yellowed in a lot of these drawings because of the kind of fixative that they use. So it's hard to say, but in the literature, it's described as being like a slightly off-white paper. Okay, so let's hop to another one here. I personally really like this one. Here, I mean, this is definitely going to be the crayon right there, and this is probably just the charcoal on its own. Part of the reason for using the charcoal is like, look at this right here. So this was erased out of that background most likely, because the way it worked is you do your weekly drawing, and then every month, I think it's every month, they would have a contest. So you would pick one of your drawings from that month to submit. And so you don't know which one you're going to submit. So the background was probably like dark all over here. And then to make room for all the writing, they just erased that. So with the charcoal, you have the option of like almost completely getting rid of anything that you've done. These things just say like, they say what contest they're for. They say the date of the judgment, the class, what prize, the student, and the teacher's name. Let's see, let's get into, here you go. Here's an eye is just like the form of the eyeball and then two little nicks. That's it. Here's an ear, kind of. And they're meant to be seen as an overall experience. And here you can kind of see a little bit of crayon supplementing the charcoal. It's usually had an outline all around them, but once you put in the background, you can't really tell. Now, having the background went in and out of popularity. Like some people did it, some people didn't. There was no requirement to do that or not. And here, let's hop to this last one here. You can kind of see a tone that's spread over like the whole face, pretty much, in this one. And then again, the fingers are worked out with, again, the Conte crayon. This one was surprising though, because this one actually has bits of white in it. And having like actual white on these is not common, but I think it was mainly for corrections in this case. So like if you mess up the paper and you can't erase it, you might put in like a little bit of white. But again, that is not a common occurrence. Here's a little bit of like accenting with the black Conte. But you can see how these were done in 12 hours though, because the process is extremely efficient. There isn't really any, there's really no time wasted on these. Every bit of the process and the materials works together to produce that result. So anyway, here, let's look at Gérôme's Atelier, and we'll start thinking about wrapping it up. I don't want to keep it too long. So here's a Dion Bouverie. He was a student of Gérôme's as well. Here's another one of his. If you want to see this one, it's in Yale. So if you want to go, I think Yale's in what, Connecticut? I think Colleen has seen these. So you just put in a request. You can see this one too. So this is actually, let me back up for a second. Let's see, where do we go? Oh yeah, so these are all works by students of Gérôme. Again, like very dimensional. Gérôme was known for emphasizing the idea of like the action and the construction and being very adamant that the students get that. And so here, actually, this is, I think this is Kenyon Cox's last cast drawing before he was allowed to work from life. Because the last cast drawing that he did, based on his letters to his mom, was of a Michelangelo figure. So it's either this one or it's another one that I have, but I think it's this one. Because he actually like signed his name on this one and everything. So I'm guessing that this is the one that was his very last cast drawing. But here I'm gonna pull up a book and I'm gonna read you an account of what it's like to be in Gérôme's Atelier and just in the Occult in general. So this is by Julian Alden Weir. He's writing to his brother in this because his brother was establishing the Yale Art School. So the reason that Yale owns all these paintings is because his brother was like, hey, buy up the best work from your friends and other people in the school and send it to us as examples. So this is a painting by Julian that ended up at in Yale also, I think. It says, you ask about the manner of study at the Beaux-Arts École. Each student that enters goes to the antique until he draws a tolerably fair figure. Not a perfect figure, but a tolerably fair figure. And then he says, and when one draws tolerably well from life, which of course is to be judged by the professor, then he goes to painting. painting only doing a part, a head, an arm, a torso, etc. And what's a great merit of the strength of the French art is that the student has his palette and color and studies to paint what he sees without any receipt for Mother Goose's remedy. In other words, to represent what he sees honestly with solid painting. So the idea there is that it's all direct painting. They're not like, there wasn't like really a way to prepare the palette. You weren't given any kind of, you basically weren't given anything. You were given the palette and you're like, all right, just make it look like the model. Didn't matter how you did it, just mattered that it looked like the model. And that was one of the changes at the time, that painting was pretty freewheeling. Like the drawing stuff was a little bit more consistent. The painting, what it has in common is that it's direct painting. That's about it. So if you look at, you know, something like this here, it's basically made out of color blocks.
Mm-hmm.
That is how painting was approached during this period. And so what they were looking for was just to try to get the absolute right note of color they were seeing on the model in that moment. It's not a kind of conceptual color that you see in earlier in the century. Now, he then goes on to say, let's see. In the drawing, they use the stump, shading just enough to express the darks and half tints, and always they make them take in the whole of the paper, the head within 1/4 of an inch of the top and the same of the bottom if standing. So basically, you fill up the entire sheet of paper with your drawing, except for like 1/4 of an inch at the top and bottom. That is something interesting because it doesn't matter how close you are to your drawing or how far away you are. And this is one of the ways you can tell that it's not sight size. Because with sight size, the size of your drawing varies depending on how close you are. With this, your drawing is the size of the sheet of paper. Doesn't matter how close you are, it doesn't matter how far you are. Your drawing is always the same size. Week after week, there's no composition for these drawings. Like the only thing you get to decide is basically how much to the side over here or over here your figure is. But you notice the drawing by the guy whose letter I'm reading, by the way. So let's see. He says, okay, so takes up the whole page. Let's see. They find where the middle would come, and then how many heads high the model is, which is comparative measurement, looking for the grand lines. Perspective, anatomy, history of art are each twice a week, but the most necessary and the greatest advantage of the occult is that we have the life model 4 hours a day to paint from. That's the morning class that I was talking about. And then in Yvonne's school, the evening class, 70 best from 4 till 6 every afternoon. And then he tells his brother that he should get somebody to endow a chair so they could have a model, you know, 4 hours a day. Now, here's another interesting thing. Let me see. So Julian Alden Weir here is talking about part of the philosophy at Jerome's school. He says, let me see. When I first went to Jerome, all that I looked for was for trying to produce a good effect of color, and as we in our ignorance say, use the model. But by degrees, Jerome led me on, till I found out that there was a human being before me which I was to represent as well as possible. So see, this is completely different than the paradigm from before, where you're just kind of using the model to create this sort of, you know, Greek god. Here, it is about the model. So he said, the human being before me which I was to represent as well as possible. He says, now, old fellow, because this is 1875, he says, now, old fellow, in the copying of a locomotive, it does not suffice to copy outside forms. The thing won't go. All the machinery must be studied, the forms, the joints, the screws. One must know where to put the bowels of the machine. Then, after all is done, a person can know where to put the red, white, and blue stripes. I don't know what that refers to. I guess they decorated locomotives with red, white, and blue stripes. He said, so is art. Must know where every bone is and the attachment of muscles. And for this reason, Jerome says, schools are necessary. In school, he says, there is your model. Represent it as close as possible, and before you touch your canvas, know what you're going to do. In this way, one will make intellectual progress. And when one returns to work in his own room, let him use what he has learned and do as he thinks. So that's the idea. It's not that what Jerome preached was understanding, and there's other quotes to this effect, understanding the action, understanding the bones. And Léon Bonnat, same thing, very similar. Understanding the character, getting the exact color of the model. They didn't care how you did it. most of the métier, like the actual quote unquote technique, you learn from your friends in class. But the teacher came to critique the logic of your study, how closely it corresponded to the model, both in terms of the individual character of the model and if it made sense, basically. So one of the things they were big on was emphasizing the landmarks, the bony landmarks. So that's something that they talk about all the time when when discussing their drawings. And hopefully, some other time we'll have a longer bit of time to get into the weeds with the painting and everything. But this is what the painting looked like. You see, it starts out from these big blocks, like basically 3 planes. One plane for the shadow, or consequently one tone associated with that plane. One plane for the halftone, one plane for the lights. 3 tones is the beginning of these things, and then you finish. So this part didn't get done, but look at how broad it is, right? It's you're working bit by bit, but you're not working inch by inch. So the idea is that you pick an area like the head, and then you model it broadly and you finish it. And then you pick something like, it's kind of like when you see people that do a lot of alla prima painting, how they do like 3-hour heads and all that. Imagine doing that over and over again. So you do like an alla prima head, then you do an alla prima chest, then you do an alla prima lower torso, then you do an alla prima arm. And that is basically the idea. That's pretty much how occult painting is done in this period. This is probably not real, but it's painting supposedly of Gérôme's atelier, and this is what's called the fer rouge. Fer means iron, rouge means red. It's basically the hot poker from the stove that they supposedly, legend has it, they would make new students strip down naked, and they would pretend like they were going to brand them. I don't know if that ever really happened, but you can kind of get a sense of what the ateliers were like. There were times when not a lot of work got done. Again, not something that I would recommend that you do at GCA, but this is what our predecessors looked like. This is another painting from Gérôme's studio. Again, same thing. You have your drawing, you have your blocks, 1, 2, 3 blocks, and then you make something out of them, and you work piece by piece. It's a painting by Gérôme, another painting by Gérôme. Here's another point that I want to make briefly. If you look at this is a drawing by Gérôme. This looks nothing like an academic drawing. That's because no one made drawings like this after they left school. This is a school drawing. This is not how people worked when they were professional artists. They would take the lessons from that kind of drawing and use it here. So you look at the line drawing that a lot of them did on top of the stumping. It kind of looks like this. This is kind of just like skipping to the line drawing part without the stumping part. And it's because this is faster. And to connect this to the point that we made in last week's lecture, you draw in a way that serves your purpose, and your purpose is not the same all the time. So here, for instance, you can see Gérôme actually kind of constructing this chair. It looks like he's like wrapping these things all the way around to the back. You can see him drawing this like little chair, probably out of his imagination, because I can't imagine babies would pose like that for very long. Also, little wings. This looks like a drawing that you would see someone do for an animation studio. It's the same kind of approach. I know people that work this way. One of my teachers actually works pretty much exactly like this. And again, academic drawing part, the studio work, these things, they're only one part of the puzzle, right? They're not the entire thing. Here's another drawing by Gérôme. This is, if you dig through my Instagram, you'll find a couple of posts about what I call the meat braid. Meat is basically this sort of this S-curve rhythm that goes up and down the entire figure in various instances. That's basically what this is. He's working with hatching. He didn't teach people to hatch. He had them use the stump. For his own work, just a little bit of hatching to express this stuff as simply as possible and as quickly as possible. And this actually relates to another point made by Pointer. Pointer was an artist about the same age as Gérôme. He studied in Glaire's atelier, and he says this. He says, I have always advised my students to make use of the stump rather than of the point in shading their drawings. For the former, while it allows of any amount of finish of modeling, lends itself particularly well to the production of broad effects of tone, and is moreover much easier for a beginner to manage than the complicated method of shading with the point. There is, it is true, an intelligent use of the point in drawing, which proceeds naturally from the study of the construction of the figure. But it should be contracted in actual drawing from the figure, and the lines made in shading with the point should always be indicative of the construction. Any student who shows a disposition to work in this way with the point should be encouraged in the use of it. But for the majority, the stump is by far the best means of learning to shade. So there it is. This is the guy who was teaching. He was teaching in England, but he was trained in France. Trained, just a little bit after Jerome. Again, in one of the same type of studios. So in any case, that was kind of a thinking at the time. And when you look at most of these drawings, most of them done with a stump, and that's the reason why. Now, real quick, I'll share with you these drawings by Frank Fowler. So Frank Fowler wrote a book. He was a student of Adolphe Vaughan. He was in that nighttime class with a bunch of these other people. He was a friend of Sargent's. And he wrote a book that's available for free online about, it's called Drawing in Charcoal and Crayon. So you can kind of wonder, you can guess what it's about. And these are the plates for the book. So you notice they have a lot in common with the Bard book. Like zero interior markings here. All the modeling, it seems for the most part, is being brought up just through values or through like specific tones. So it's not just copying the shapes, but like the tones are tied to specific planes. But again, it's like, this is actually a book you can use as you can think of it as the instruction manual for the Bard plates. Right? So that, like, because the way that people work on the Bard plates today is not how they were intended, I don't think. I found recently this this piece of in this book from Belgium. There was a little thing about the Bard where he says that he thinks that the shading for the Bard plates should actually be done with a stump. So it's not, the Bard plates are not meant to take a long time. They're meant to be something you can like work through like, relatively quickly, and just so that you can acquire the kind of like facility with the process, so that you can work. But anyway, the Fowler book is worth looking up. He has instructions for literally all these plates, like for like every step of the way, more or less. The drawings themselves are not great, but the ideas are the same ideas. So anyway, let's take a look at a couple of unfinished academies from this period. So these are all, I think we looked at these before, the Croyer drawings. This is an interesting one. This is by Kenyon Cox. This is from Yvonne's class. He was ranked 40th out of 70 or thereabouts. So he didn't get a good spot because basically whoever was top ranked got to choose their place first in front of the model. And so he was complaining to his mom that he didn't get a good spot and that he couldn't do anything good because he got a bad spot. So this was the drawing that he made for that. Now, the reason I know that's the drawing is because when I found that one, here was an academic database. When I found that drawing, I recognized the model, which again, you could only do in these sort of later Occult drawings. But if we go in here, let me see. So here we go. There's, actually, let me get rid of this one right there. So we have the Kenyon Cox, didn't win a prize, didn't win anything. This drawing actually lives in New York. So if you want to go see it, it's at the Cooper Hewitt. So anyway, didn't get a prize, but you did get a prize. All these other people. So these all won medals in the same contest. They're from the same year. They're from the same week, basically. These were just people that, got better seats because they had placed better in the class. Now, that's actually one of the maybe not so great things about the Occult is that if you made it to the top, you stayed on top because you got the best spots every time. And if you were at the bottom, you kind of stayed at the bottom. So anyway, there's that aspect to it as well. And let's see, close this out. Oh yeah, and we have a couple of other like miscellaneous like unfinished drawings. Now this is an interesting one. This is by Dennis Miller Bunker. Dennis Miller Bunker was an American. He went to study with Jerome, but you notice that his drawing is different than other drawings by Jerome students. It's pretty flat. At this point, this is basically becoming just a purely optical experience. Every decision that he makes looks like it's driven primarily by this idea of this kind of like just shape, 2D shape. rather than by 3D form. You know, the lights are, you know, kept really unified, but they're kind of looking a little flat. When you look at the drawing is still done with a stump. The process is still basically the same, but the thinking is changing, right? And again, I mean, here this is by Halil Pasha, who was a Turkish student of Jerome. Here you can see the process pretty clearly. Again, here's the charcoal stage, here's the line drawing, here's the filling in the shadows, here's the crayon right there. These are on Google Images or on Google Art Project, so you can actually see them in high res, like for free, anytime that you want. These are by Julian Alden Weir. This is a pretty early one. This is a later one. This is what their lay-ins looked like at this point. His lay-ins are still pretty dimensional. He's still thinking about like forms in front of forms, it looks like, but they're getting a little simpler. And in fact, when you look at that, they actually don't look that different from the drawings in the Bard course. Not in the front part of it, because the Bard course starts with like really straight, strict, very strict straight lines. But by the time you get to the back of the book, it's basically every line is a curve almost by the time you get to here. And that, I think, is more or less how a lot of the later occult drawings were probably started. Most of these drawings actually started with a plumb line, by the way. So you'd make a vertical line, you'd measure how many heads you're going to put in there, you divide your vertical line into however many heads the model is, and then you start putting in the head, the tilt of the hips, the tilt of the shoulders, and the standing leg. And most poses were standing. So you would start with that, and from there, it would basically look like this. Here's a book by another person who went to the Occult. It's also another one of those like easy drawing for everybody type of books. And it talks about a lot of perspective, and then hunting, I guess, for whatever reason. And this is more or less how one of those drawings would start. So here's the plumb line, here are the measurements, and then here are the basic indications for you know, the main tilts of the figure. Let's see, let's go back. There's another one for a cast that was really good. Oh yeah. So here's the cast. Here's a plumb line. Plumb line has measurements on it. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, almost 8 heads tall. And here is an illustration of, actually I have it a little better here. Here's a student with a plumb line. Here's a student measuring with a pencil. So you would use the pencil and the plumb line to basically like figure out where everything goes. The plumb line is just for vertical alignments. The pencil is for measuring. So here's another kid with a plumb line. Here's another one with here two with pencil measuring. And then see, they have this. They just have like a wire basically that goes through like a railing where they can like lean their boards, and they're just sitting on chairs. And then like one guy gets an easel, and that's it. Anyway, so surprisingly enough, I mean, we actually know a lot about how these people work. It's just the information doesn't make the rounds a lot of the time. But here's a little bit from Fowler. He says there are two methods of working in charcoal. One in which the charcoal point is used alone, the shading being put in lines which are not blended, no stump, or rubbing together of any kind being allowed. This style of drawing is principally used in illustrating, as it is more easily reproduced than those which are in which a stump is used. Full details of working in this manner will be given later. The other method is that in which the charcoal is blended with a stump, no lines being visible in modeling. This manner of drawing is that most generally employed in art schools and is susceptible to higher finish than the other. It is also in this way that charcoal and crayon portraits are managed, blah, 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 blah. So this book was written in 1885. Fowler was at school in the 1870s. So he's talking about like this exact period, like right around here, and he's saying that most people in most schools worked with the stumps and with charcoal and finished up with crayon. Here's a couple more. These are little like false starts by Kenyon Cox when he was like first learning how to draw. These are all in New York, by the way. And so I find that studying drawings that are not that great but are kind of like half-baked is actually really useful because everything's more clear. So here you can see the charcoal. Here you can see him stumping over it. Here's a little stump patch. Here he's like attempting to finish this. Here's his like blocking for the figure. This is probably just done with the charcoal so far. Here's another one where he's trying to get the hang of the stumping. You know, he's getting there. He did eventually, you know, learn all that. And here's a much later one by a student of Bouguereau and, let's see, I think we only know that he studied with Bouguereau. This is William Lepara. If anybody knows who Yves Gamel is, I think Lepara was one of his teachers actually when he went to France, but Gamel had to leave France because of World War I, so he didn't get to like stay for very long. But this is like a much later, like 1890s block-in. Yeah, it's a slightly different different animal than these earlier ones. And here we'll wrap up pretty quick actually. So this is by Adolphe Yvon. He put out a book for the use of high school students and like municipal schools and whatever. So this is a book by the guy who taught the drawing class at the Occult, like the evening drawing class. So you notice two things. You notice conceptual proportions, right? But also what looks like fairly optical angle matching. So fairly optical through here, and then a cylinder, a conceptual cylinder. And he says something in here, oh, these are fairly low res, but he says something in here about how this idea of thinking of the head as a cylinder with these lines running in this direction, or the opposite here, they should be burned into the student's memory. So even though constructive drawing of this kind is not explicitly being used here anymore in these drawings, you're still thinking about it in some sense. Those ideas are still there. And these are the finished drawings by Yvon. Again, Yvon is most likely the person who introduced charcoal drawing, by the way, and who like popularized it. Here are a couple more. See, this is a combination. You have that basic egg, right? You have the axis for it. You have these lines running around, and you have angle matching. And here's a little plumb line. So here is him talking about the proportions of the figure, but also shows you a little bit of his method, most likely. You notice that he shoots down to the leg, shoots down all the way through, and then comes back and puts in the swelling of the actual contour. So it's basically like boom, straight to the knee, straight to the floor, actually, and then coming back and adding the stuff afterwards, right? And so this is a little step by step. So it's this, then refining the outline. So this is basically, you do this, you measure it out, make sure everything's good, then you go back over it, then you model it, that's it. And then he has, like breakdown of the skeleton, breakdown of the muscles. Here's another one. And see, here you can see like the actual like breakdown of this is a diagram for proportions, but they would do the same thing with the live model. And these aren't great drawings really, like they're not, you can even see that these are actually a little bit like idealized too. But this is the guy who was teaching. So there's always a little bit of a gap between what the teacher does and what the students do. The students produce much more naturalistic work than I think Yvon ever did. But he was the teacher who was running the whole show for a very long time. So anyway, I think that you can see some common aspects between that and the Bard book. I think that kind of gives you a reasonable idea of more or less how people were working. I'll show you a few more things here. Like these are just, we'll run through these really quickly, but here are the Bard drawings, the ones from the book. These are Bard's drawings that he did for himself. These are the drawings that he did for work, like when he was making paintings. So you notice, this is just a way of learning. This is not a way of drawing. This is how a working artist worked, at least how this working artist worked. Here's more by Barg. Those Barg straight lines are gone in a lot of instances. These two paintings are at the Met, by the way. These are two of my favorite things there. This one's in Boston. This one's like 9 by 13 inches or something. It's crazy. If you make it to Boston, go to the MFA, and if it's not on display, ask to see it. That I had to do. They have it in like this basement thing, but it's well worth checking out. See, look at how different this is than the Barg plates. Again, same guy. This is Barg. This is a drawing by Barg also. This is Barg sketching. And it's a Barg because it has the stamp from his estate sale. Here's a Barg, basically just gesture, and then there's one from the book. So academic drawing is not how you draw when you're actually working. Academic drawing is just how you learn to draw. It's a fairly restrictive, fairly abstract way of going about it. it's really useful. You learn everything that you need to learn. It's very thorough is the main thing about it. But that's not what most people later on. This is by Paul Baudry. This is well, this is attributed to Paul Baudry, but it's probably his. This is from Drolling Studio, most likely. This one's definitely a Paul Baudry. This is also a Paul Baudry from later on when he was working on decorations for some ceilings or something. This is also a Paul Baudry. You notice this looks just like a Renaissance drawing, or this could be like a drawing by the Caricature or something. See, linear drawing that's indicative of the construction, just like Pointer said. That's what they end up doing, because you know there aren't any surviving academic drawings by Baudry, but I'm sure he did the same thing as everybody else. Why wouldn't he? You know, it's not like Drolling would allow him to do anything else. This is a study by him, so this is a more worked up study. But again, no one, basically, you wouldn't really do like fully shaded academic drawings unless you had a real good reason to. And see, this study is in preparation for this figure. This I think this is a painting that he sent back from Rome. So for the Prix de Rome, this is like one of the things that he did. He's one of his torso paintings, some you know, flying cherubs. This is the painting that won him the prize. You notice actually there are some bits of this that are really naturalistic, like for instance like that guy's arm and all that. But then there's like people like this guy that are complete, or like this guy is probably completely made up. I'm also not convinced that these aren't the same person, like these two right here. They only had so many models at the Occult, so they had to use like the same few people for a bunch of stuff. These are copies after Michelangelo by Baudry that he had to do at the Academy in Rome. And this is by Bouguereau. So these are sketches by Bouguereau. We're using this drawing by Peels as a kind of stand-in, because you know Bouguereau probably did some work like this, even though we don't have any of it. But this is the kind of classwork they were doing with his teacher. And see, these are later, this is a Bouguereau drawing too, a little gesture sketch. This is the, you know, a heavily hacked drawing that he did in preparation for a painting. You know, these are like little detail studies for specific things, same with these. These are Bouguereau sketches for compositions. Apparently he would do these like during meetings. This one is supposed to be a Bouguereau study. I don't think they're, it's attributed to Bouguereau, so maybe it's his, maybe it isn't. But again, very likely he made things like this in school. And then these are his little sketches, planning things out, gesture drawings. You know, then this gesture drawing eventually turned into this, you know, study with the model. Again, very direct painting, no preparation, no underpainting, no nothing. Just a charcoal drawing, which you can see here, and then paint it. There's actually a great quote about a Jerome student whose his name is Wyatt Eaton. And so he looked at like some popular artist and he was like underpainting the model with like purple and yellow and all this crazy stuff, and he thought he was going to paint over it in the, you know, the actual like the color that he saw. But Jerome came by and he was standing behind him, and he says, "Do you really see the color on the model like that?" And he was like, he starts stammering. He's no, but I'm preparing this so I can paint over it. Apparently Jerome looked at him and he said, "Prepare nothing, paint." And you can see that in a lot of their work. Like it's pretty bare. Like they have a charcoal drawing and then you start painting. Like no underpainting, no, not even the brown shadows. That they stopped doing that after like a certain point, about halfway through the century. Anyway, a couple more Bouguereaus there. This is a drawing of Adolf von Menzel by Bouguereau. Again, more by Bouguereau. Again, linear drawing, done with the point, indicative of the construction, just like Pointer said. Here are little like gesture sketches and like little conceptual figures by Bouguereau. He has a little axis on the heads. And on the same page, you know, a fully finished, very naturalistic head study. Apparently this would take him like 4 hours from what I've read. This is Cabanel, another one of the studio heads. Again, very conceptual sometimes, very idealized, other times more naturalistic. These drawings almost look like, again, like they could be like by Raphael or by, I mean, they're not exactly like that, but they're the same idea, that they're construction drawings, that they're drawings based on knowledge rather than purely on perception of just like certain optical phenomena. This one actually could be a Raphael. Again, these are drawings that are 3D, they're built, they're not just recorded. This is a drawing for like Satan leaving paradise after tempting Eve. There's a Fallen Angel by Cabanel. This is, okay, like, you see how conceptual these things got once they were working, like, on their own things. You know, this is actually, like, a really bizarre, this one doesn't even make sense. But again, very, very conceptual. And again, it's mostly a line drawing, right? Like I was saying before, line drawing can express form. You know, it doesn't matter if it's line or tone. Either one can be used for that. And here's Cabanel using the stump. Little sketch by Cabanel for this painting. And here's Kenyon Cox again. That study Kenyon Cox. This is a composition drawing by Kenyon Cox. This is a pen drawing by Kenyon Cox for his parents. This is Kenyon Cox designing money. This is like a banknote that he was putting together for U.S. currency, actually. Never got used, but this is the kind of drawing that Kenyon Cox made once he got back to the United States. So somehow in the midst of all those academic drawings, they learned how to make these working drawings. So out of this comes something like this, which is, you know, more personal, it's more expressive of certain things that he wanted to do. There's a kind of like Michelangelo-esque kind of quality to them in the bulk. Here's a self-portrait caricature that he did. And again, this is a later drawing. He's going back to the idealization. He actually is moving away from that kind of naturalism and going right back to this because it's appropriate for what he's doing. So anyway, and here's a few other ones. This is just like young Kenyon Cox. These are all by Jerome. A couple of dogs. Jerome, apparently, big dog guy seems like. This is a dog named Boy. You know, here's a sketch by Jerome. Again, not particularly optical. Here's the other drawing that we saw before. Here's a Jerome painting in progress. A very clear outline, fully finished, and then just painting top to bottom. Here's a Jerome painting at the Met. Here's that painting again. Jerome figure. A drawing of a monkey. Also by Jerome. Drawing of a dog. More dogs. A dog named Marenko. Also, not a great drawing, this one in particular, but you know, it's interesting to look at these artists with a little bit more of with a little bit more perspective. You get to see that they're not perfect, but they did have principles that they held to that were very consistent all the way through. Okay, last thing we're going to look at is we're just going to look very quickly at a progression from where we started to where we ended. Now, after this period that we looked at, again, we start with the Lemoine, we went to the Notoire. These are not necessarily people that studied with each other. These are just drawings that are like representative of a certain like decade. So this is like a very, you know, this is like a typical sort of like 1780s, 1760s kind of drawing. So, okay, remember where we start, right? We start like, you know, fairly idealized in a sense. You know, we start with a lot of hatching, you know, also some use of the stump. Again, very free kind of drawing, very quick kind of drawing, probably done in like 6 hours or less. Again, same thing here. And then notice how as we advance through the decades, they start to get more and more and more and more naturalistic. But again, some of the knowledge of form is starting to disappear. Like for instance here, there isn't as much knowledge of anatomy here, I don't think. Maybe you just couldn't see it on the model. Okay, you still feel that this is very three-dimensional, but even the lay-in looks a little bit more two-dimensional, right? It doesn't quite look as 3D as some of the other things we've seen. But it comes and goes. This drawing by Air is very dimensional. But again, the character of the model now is very fully realized. As we work through these start to look, you know, probably pretty much exactly like what the model looked like. This is one by Gabriel Ferrier that he did when he was 19. He was a student of Peele's and he was eventually a student of Yvonne. This one is at the Getty too, so I'm going to try to get some pictures of this one pretty soon. Again, you can see the stumping, you can see the something of the charcoal, you can see the crayon on top. Yeah, here's a little crayon right there. And again, 1870s, 1875, you know, 1880s. And we're getting increasingly naturalistic. There's increasingly a desire to put the figure in with a background to study the tone relations. And then we get to here. It starts to dissolve. There's so much study of the overall global relationships of the values overall that the parts of the figure stop mattering, and basically it becomes more about the entire scene, right? And that is basically Impressionism. You know, and not surprisingly, Bunker was an American Impressionist. Now, you'll notice this started to creep into the occult too. So by this point, this is 1902, the drawings basically dissolve. Look at, there's no contour there anymore. The form, like basically, if it looks like the shadow melts into the background, then it does melt into the background. You know, like, when you look back, it really started. The priorities are completely different. The way of drawing is different. There's stumping in both of them, but this one, you know, also from the 1900s. Again, more of the environment is being put in. It's not the same thing as this. It's not the same thing as that. You know, it's just, again, it's very particular, but it's not based on the model. Well, it's not based on the sort of like objective nature of the model or the kind of tactile nature. It's a portrait of the light at this point, or at least it's becoming. And that basically takes us into the 20th century. Now, and these things it's not quite as linear. These things kind of ebb and flow, and there was a resurgence of some constructive drawing, usually linear constructive drawing in the 20th century. But for the 19th century, that about does it for us. So thank you for hanging in there, folks. That was helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.